Chapter 1964. Di Shirtion, calm down. Nyetian saw Di Shirtion going crazy and immediately roared. Di Shirtion's eyes trembled, and then he calmed down a lot, but his eyes were lifeless, as if he had lost all his faith in an instant. Di Shirtion is sincere to Lien Wui. Nyetian looked at Di Shirtion's soulless appearance, and only then did he react. He was very surprised in his heart. Although Di Shirtion looked like he was only 6 or 7 years old, his mind was so mature that it couldn't be any more mature. After being with Lien Wui day and night, it was normal for his heart to be moved. But Lien Wui's current situation was very difficult, and she was already on the verge of life and death. Boss Chinchilla. Suddenly, Di Shirtion's eyes flickered, and he actually knelt in front of Fat Cat. His eyes were moist, and he said in a trembling voice, "Boss Chinchilla, I know that you must have a way to save Wui. You must have a way to save her. I beg you, save her." Di Shirtion's sudden action gave Nyetian a fright. Although Sakura had always been a little brother in front of little Fat Cat, the two of them were still equal in status. Di Shirtion was a legendary swordsman, and he had the pride of a swordsman in his blood. At this moment, he was kneeling in front of Fat Cat, which showed how important Lien Wui was in his heart. Di Shirtion, what are you doing? Stand up first. Fat Cat was stunned for a moment, and then a strange look flashed on his face, and he said, "This deity really has no way to save her. Don't make it difficult for this deity. Boss Chinchilla, if you don't save Wui, I will kneel in front of you and never get up." Di Shirtion firmly believed that Fat Cat had a way to save Wui, so he insisted very persistently. Fat Cat frowned, and his face became hesitant. Nyetian couldn't stand it anymore and said, "Fat, Di Shirtion is already like this. If you really have a way to save her, just say it." Nyetian knew Fat Cat very well. The latter's expression just now indicated that Lien Wui was definitely not at the point where death was certain. The Fat Cat's sapphire-like eyes flickered, and her expression changed again. She sighed a few times before saying, "I do have a way to save them, but the risk is too great. I'm afraid you can't afford it." "What method?" Nyetian's expression changed as he asked anxiously. "Boss Chinchilla, I can bear any risk. Even if it's my life, I won't hesitate." Sakura was extremely excited, his eyes trembling as he said. In order to save Lien Wui, Sakura was willing to sacrifice his own life. This was Lien Wui's position in his heart. Fat Cat looked at Di Shirtion. His fat head shook for a long time, and finally opened his mouth to ask, "Di Shirtion, have you really thought it through? Are you willing to risk your life for this little girl?" "I've thought it through," Sakura blurted out without hesitation. "AI." When Fat Cat saw Sakura's action, she couldn't help but sigh and said, "Since you have made your own choice, then this deity will help you once." Nyetian frowned, not knowing what method Fat Cat had thought of. Previously, Fat Cat hadn't found a way to suppress the blood-weeping sword infant. Now that the blood-weeping sword infant was out of control, would Fat Cat really have a way? Seeing how Fat Cat was so hesitant before agreeing to Sakura, it could be imagined that it must be a very dangerous method. "Nyetian, hold on for a while more." Fat Cat glanced at Nyetian, then turned her gaze to Sakura and said, "Sakura, this deity will first tell you about the blood-weeping sword infant. After you know about it, don't get too excited." Sakura nodded heavily and agreed. Then, Fat Cat told him about the blood-weeping sword infant in Lien Wui's body and explained clearly to Sakura what the blood-weeping sword infant was. After listening, Sakura's face became extremely gloomy and said, "The reason why Wui is in danger is because the blood-weeping sword infant in her body is out of control." "Yes." Fat Cat nodded helplessly. "Damn it," Sakura roared and said violently. "How can there be such a thing in Wui's body? Who did it?" Fat Cat already knew that Sakura would get excited, so she hurriedly said, "Sakura, now is not the time for you to be angry. The most important thing now is to find a way to save the little girl." "How to save her?" Sakura calmed down instantly and looked at Fat Cat with a burning gaze. Fat Cat took a deep breath and said, The reason why the little girl is in danger is because of the existence of the blood-weeping sword infant. As long as we take out the blood-weeping sword infant in her body, she will naturally wake up. How we take it out? Tian and Sakura were stunned at the same time and asked at the same time. Fat Cat's words were simple, but it was definitely very difficult to do in reality. Otherwise, he would have already said it. The blood-weeping sword infant has existed in Lien Wui's body since she was very young. It is already integrated with her body, so it is very difficult to take it out. Fat Cat's face became serious and said, "The blood-weeping sword infant absorbs the swordsman's sword intent. Only when it encounters a more terrifying sword intent will it become restless and may even leave the host's body." Fat, you want to use Sakura to lure the blood-weeping sword infant out? Hearing this, Tian immediately understood and said in astonishment, "The blood-weeping sword infant lived by devouring sword intent. The stronger the sword intent, the stronger the attraction. If someone's sword intent was strong enough, they could lure the blood-weeping sword infant and make it leave the host's body." Exactly. Fat Cat nodded and said, "In fact, this method is very stupid. It is just to transfer the blood-weeping sword infant from one person's body to another's body." When Tian heard this, his face couldn't help but change, and he completely understood. The method Fat Cat mentioned was actually to transfer the blood-weeping sword infant from Lien Wui's body to Sakura's body. But in this way, Sakura would have to bear the pressure of the blood-weeping sword infant. This method is very risky. I don't know what will happen to the person who accepts the blood-weeping sword infant. Fat Cat frowned. He had been unwilling to speak before because he was worried that the blood-weeping sword infant would directly take Sakura's life. After all, the blood-weeping sword infant had grown strong enough in Lien Wui's body. If it suddenly entered Sakura's body, would the latter be able to bear it? Even if Sakura was a legendary swordsman, his martial body was too weak. "Fat, can you transfer the blood-weeping sword infant into my body?" At this time, Tian's eyes lit up and he asked excitedly. He had the power of demons and gods, so he was not afraid of the blood-weeping sword infant at all. Moreover, the more blood-weeping sword infant he absorbed, the more help it would be to Tian. "No." Fat Cat shook his head and said, "Your sword intent is too weak. It is not enough to attract the blood-weeping sword infant." The blood-weeping sword infant transfer was actually to find a stronger host. At this time, Tian was only a swordsman in the realm of sword oblivion. His sword intent might not be as strong as Lien Wui's, so it was naturally impossible for him to attract the blood-weeping sword infant. Chapter 1965. The blood-weeping sword infant survived by devouring sword intent. The stronger the sword intent, the stronger its attraction. Indra was a legendary swordsman who had fused sword and martial arts into one. If it was only about sword intent, perhaps even Gongsun Sheng, who was also a legendary swordsman, couldn't compare to him. His sword intent was extremely attractive to the blood-weeping sword infant. Using Indra's sword intent as bait, it would definitely be able to extract the blood-weeping sword infant from Lien Wui's body. Indra, you already know what the blood-weeping sword infant is. If you give up now, it's still not too late. Fat Cat looked at Indra and said with a heavy gaze. He couldn't be sure what would happen after the blood-weeping sword infant entered Indra's body, so he was very worried about Indra's safety. "Boss Chinchilla, let's begin." Indra said directly. His eyes were very firm. He had already proved his determination just now. Even if his life was in danger, he must save Lien Wui. Tian, go out and tell the people outside that no matter what happens, no one is allowed to step into the room. Fat Cat nodded, then looked at Tian and said with a serious face. Tian was stunned for a moment and couldn't help but look at Lien Wui with some worry. He was worried that if he walked away, Lien Wui's breath of life would immediately disappear. "Don't worry, this little girl won't die for a while." Fat Cat pretended to be relaxed, smiled, and said with a nod. Tian agreed and walked out of the room. "Tian, what's the situation inside?" Wu Quang Sha didn't dare to enter the room and had been waiting outside. At this time, When he saw Nie Tian walk out, he asked anxiously, Nie Tian, is Wui okay? Xian Zongfeng, who was at the side, was also very nervous and asked, She won't die for the time being, but no one knows what will happen next. Nie Tianling looked at Xian Zongfeng coldly and didn't hide the disgust in his heart. He said with a heavy voice, I will think of a way to save Lien Wui. Before I walk out of the room, no one is allowed to enter. Xian Zongfeng frowned as if he was dissatisfied with Nie Tian's attitude, but he did not get angry. He made a sound of doubt and stopped talking. However, there was a strange light surging in his eyes. Xian Zongfeng had already sensed that the blood-weeping sword infant in Lien Wui's body had gone berserk and couldn't be suppressed anymore. Therefore, he did not believe that Nie Tian had the ability to save Lien Wui. Nie Tian, I'd like to see how you're going to save them. Xian Zongfeng glanced at Nie Tian from the corner of his eyes and said cold, Lord Gui Wu, I'll have to trouble you to wait outside. Don't let anyone near the room. Nie Tian did not care about Xian Zongfeng and bowed to Gui Wu Kwangsha. Relax. With me around, no one will be able to get close to this room. Gui Wu Kwangsha nodded his head heavily, while a powerful sword intent radiated from his entire body, displaying his determination. Nie Tian nodded slightly and turned to enter the room. When he returned to his room, the scene in front of him made Nie Tian stunned. In the room, rays of light overflowed, and glazed runes circulated in the space, forming a strange array. In the blink of an eye, Fat Cat had laid down an array. Nie Tian sensed it with his divine sense, and immediately discovered that the array in front of him had two core positions, and Dishir Tian and Lien Wui were sitting cross-legged there. This array was obviously used to help Fat Cat transfer the blood-weeping sword infant. Dishir Tian, now enter the state of cultivation wholeheartedly, just like usual, but you have to slowly release the sword intent in your body. Do not rush, you must do it slowly. Fat Cat's voice sounded, and then an exaggeratedly fat paw stretched out. A glazed light gushed out like a gurgling stream and slowly flowed into the array. Boom! The array sensed it and suddenly shook, then began to operate. What a strange array aura! Nie Tian felt the aura of the array runes and couldn't help but be surprised. Fat Cat was indeed a master of arrays. The array that was set up in a short period of time not only had a strong aura, but also had a very wonderful effect. Nie Tian could clearly feel that the power of the array could actually stimulate a stronger sword intent. At this time, a sword intent began to gush out of Dishir Tian's body, flowing in the array, releasing a very strong aura. So strange. Nie Tian suddenly felt that the aura of the sword intent released by Sakura Heaven seemed to have become much stronger. However, when he tried to sense it, he didn't feel any change in the sword intent. Only the aura had become stronger. Nie Tian immediately understood that Fat Cat's array only enhanced the sword intent aura of Dishir Tian, so as to attract the blood-weeping sword infant in Lien Wui's body. This method was like a hunter deliberately smearing a tempting aura on the bait to lure its prey. Now, Fat Cat was the hunter, the blood-weeping sword infant was the prey, and Dishir Tian's sword intent was the bait. As Dishir Tian continued to release sword intent, the sword intent aura within the array became stronger and stronger, turning into streams of light that surged within the array. It's about time. After a moment, Fat Cat smiled faintly, then took a deep breath. Two of its fat paws formed a strange seal, and suddenly, a strange scene occurred. Boom! The sword intent within the array was drawn by a force, and it spread toward Lien Wui, directly enveloping the latter. When Nie Tian saw this scene, his expression couldn't help but change, not knowing what Fat Cat was going to do. Fat Cat took another deep breath, then formed another seal with its hands. The sword intent that enveloped Lien Wui's body sensed it and actually became violet, showing a very strange state of mist. Right at this moment, Lien Wui's body suddenly shuddered, as if she had been electrocuted. Nie Tian was attracted by this sudden scene. and he used his divine sense to investigate. He could feel that the blood-weeping sword infant within Lien Wui's body had become very agitated, and it actually wanted to come out at all costs. It seemed that Fat Cat's method was working. The blood-weeping sword infant was attracted by Di Shi Tian's sword intent, and it wanted to leave Lien Wui's body in order to find a more powerful host. However, this process didn't seem to be simple. Nie Tian could clearly feel that Lien Wui's body was undergoing a shocking change. The blood-weeping sword infant transformed into a series of blood-colored runes that crashed into Lien Wui's body, as if it wanted to shatter her body. Lien Wui was currently in an unconscious state, and if she were still awake, he really didn't know if she would be able to withstand this kind of pain. Whoosh! Right at this moment, a blood-colored rune suddenly surged out from Lien Wui's body, and it was like a glaring, blood-colored thread that was extremely bloody. This is the blood-weeping sword infant. Nie Tian's eyes lit up, and he couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. The blood-weeping sword infant really did come out from Lien Wui's body. Chapter 1966. Nie Tian was stunned when he heard what Fat Cat said. It seemed like he was happy too early. It wasn't easy to take out the blood-weeping sword infant completely. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Next, blood-weeping runes kept surging out of Lien Wui's body. They were like red threads that intertwined with each other, forming a dense blood vortex. Nie Tian watched from aside, and his heart was in his throat. He was afraid that something bad would happen. Fortunately, everything was going very smoothly. About half an hour later, the blood-colored runes wrapped around Lien Wui's entire body. All the blood-colored runes connected together and formed a vague, humanoid shape. Is this what the blood-weeping sword infant looks like? Nie Tian's eyes couldn't help but flicker as he watched from the side. The blood-colored figure wrapped in Lien Wui's clothes was clearly in the shape of a baby. At this moment, the blood-weeping sword infant inside Lien Wui's body had been completely taken out. It was like a blood-colored coat that covered her body. What came next was the real, critical moment. Fat Cat had to carefully control the blood-weeping sword infant to enter Indra's body. At this time, if the blood-weeping sword infant felt that something was wrong, it would directly return to Lien Wui's body. If that was the case, then Lien Wui would be dead for sure. Sakura, start releasing your sword intent. Little Fat Cat suddenly opened its mouth and growled. Boom! When Indra heard Fat Cat's words, he didn't hesitate at all. The sword intent in his body surged, and suddenly it was released like a mountain, filling the entire room. At this time, Indra didn't need to control his sword intent anymore. What he needed to do was to display the strength of his sword intent as much as possible and let the blood-weeping sword infant enter his body. Indra's sword intent was very strong, and he controlled it just right. Although he released his aura, it didn't have any destructive power. At this time, the blood-weeping sword infant suddenly made an ear-piercing sound and instantly became agitated, as if it was going to completely leave Lien Wui. At the same time, outside the room. What's going on? Why do I feel an unusually terrifying sword intent in the room? Qian Zongfeng frowned and said impatiently. He could tell that this was Sakura's sword intent, but he didn't know what Sakura and the others were doing in the room. Guiwu Guangsha ignored Qian Zongfeng and looked at the room indifferently, guarding it. Qian Zongfeng's face darkened. He suddenly had a feeling that Nie Tian might really be able to save Lien Wui. However, he really couldn't figure out how Nie Tian was going to suppress the blood-weeping sword infant that had already gone out of control. In the room, the blood tears sword nascent soul around Lien Wui's body swayed violently. It was already in an extremely active state, as if it could leave Lien Wui at any moment. Hua! Right at this moment, the blood-weeping sword infant suddenly sprang into action. It left Lien Wui's body and transformed into a crimson vortex that hurtled toward Sakura Heaven. Sakura didn't have time to react and was hit by the blood-color vortex. The blood-color vortex was very strange. The moment it hit Sakura, it directly entered his body. In an instant, Sakura Heaven felt a tearing pain in his body, as if there were countless sharp blades that were madly cutting his body. Nie Tian's eyes trembled, and he suddenly became nervous. Nie Tian, don't worry too much. Save the little girl first. At this time, Fat Cat's voice sounded, telling Nie Tian to save Lien Wui. Lien Wui's blood-weeping sword infant had been taken out, but her body was very weak, and she needed the power of Nie Tian's Terra vein source. Nie Tian nodded in agreement, and his figure moved to Lien Wui's side, and a huge amount of Terra vein source's power flowed into the latter's body. At this moment, Lien Wui opened her eyes and saw Nie Tian's face. She opened her mouth with difficulty and said, Nie Tian, what happened to me? You're a little injured, but you're fine now. Seeing that Lien Wui had woken up, Nie Tian's tense face finally relaxed a little, and he forced a smile. However, at this time, Sakura Heaven let out a heart-wrenching howl. His voice was originally immature, and it was especially heart-wrenching for him to cry out like this. Little brother, Shi Tian. Lien Wui heard clearly that it was Sakura Heaven's voice, and her pretty face changed. She stood up, looked at Sakura Heaven, who was suffering from great pain, and exclaimed, Little brother Shi Tian, what happened to you? Nie Tian grabbed Lien Wui. Of course, he couldn't tell the latter that Sakura Heaven became like this because of saving her, so he could only say, Sakura Heaven is fine. He'll be fine in a while. Nie Tian wasn't sure what would happen to Sakura Heaven next, but he still chose to believe that Sakura Heaven would be fine. But then, Sakura Heaven's howl became louder, and his small body trembled uncontrollably. His immature face had become completely distorted. Sakura Heaven will be fine, right? Nie Tian looked at the scene in front of him and couldn't help but ask. Fat Cat shook her head and said, He's trying to fuse with the blood-weeping sword infant. None of us can help him. He can only rely on himself. Nie Tian sucked in a breath of cold air, and he couldn't hide the worry on his face. He really wasn't sure if Sakura Heaven could successfully fuse with the blood-weeping sword infant. Lien Wui watched from the side, and her heart ached, and tears flowed down her cheeks. Outside the room, Xian Zongfeng heard Sakura Heaven's screams and couldn't help but want to go into the room to see what had happened. But just when he wanted to go forward, he was stopped by Ghost Marshal Sand, who said cold, Lord Swordmaster Wu, have you forgotten Nie Tian's warning? Before Nie Tian comes out, none of us can enter the room. Xian Zongfeng glanced at Ghost Marshal Sand and finally took a step back. He couldn't make a move against Ghost Marshal Sand for such a small matter. At this time, Sakura Heaven's voice attracted even more people. Everyone gathered outside the small courtyard and didn't dare to walk in. They could only watch from afar. In the room, Shi Tian's miserable howls continued one after another, but his body slowly stopped trembling. After a moment, Sakura Heaven's screams became weaker and finally disappeared. It's a success. Little Fat Cat immediately sensed something and cried out in joy, going wild with joy. Sakura Heaven had successfully fused with the blood-weeping sword infant. Although the blood-weeping sword infant was still in danger of slowly growing up in Sakura Heaven's body, at least Sakura Heaven's life wasn't in danger now. Nie Tian reacted, and his face changed. His tense nerves finally relaxed. Sakura Heaven's screams just now were indeed heart-wrenching. Fortunately, there was no danger. Sakura Heaven's sword intent finally suppressed the blood-weeping sword infant. Chapter 1967. In a small courtyard, Nie Tian pushed open the door and walked out. Nie Tian. Xian Zongfeng had been waiting for a long time. When he saw Nie Tian finally walk out, he called out. However, when he saw the figure behind Nie Tian, his face froze. After a few seconds, he reacted and said with a trembling voice, Wui. Xian Zongfeng didn't expect that Lien Wui's breath would return to normal. When he tried to sense Lien Wui's breath, his expression changed, and he was shocked to the extreme. There was no longer the breath of the blood-weeping sword infant in Lien Wui's body. How was this possible? Xian Zongfeng couldn't believe his eyes. The blood-weeping sword infant in Lien Wui's body was still there, but it disappeared after she walked out of the room. Xian Zongfeng was horrified and didn't know what happened. The blood-weeping sword infant was a terrifying thing. Moreover, the blood-weeping sword infant in Lien Wui's body was out of control. So how could it suddenly disappear? Xian Zongfeng previously thought that Nie Tian couldn't save Lien Wui because the latter couldn't handle the blood-weeping sword infant. Who would have thought that the blood-weeping sword infant in Lien Wui's body would disappear? All of this was too strange and far beyond Xian Zongfeng's expectation. "Teacher, are you all right?" Lien Wui saw that Xian Zongfeng's expression didn't look too good and asked with concern. This little girl still didn't know that the person in front of her, whom she called teacher, had been harming her all along. "No, I'm fine." Xian Zongfeng forced himself to calm down and waved his hand. Nie Tian saw Xian Zongfeng's reaction and guessed what the latter was thinking. He smiled faintly and said, "Sword Master Wu, you seem to be very surprised." "Surprised?" Xian Zongfeng tried to hide it and squeezed out a smile, but his expression was uglier than crying. Nie Tian laughed and no longer cared about Xian Zongfeng. But at this moment, Xian Zongfeng's gaze suddenly landed on Di Shi Tian. He seemed to have found something, and his eyes lit up, revealing an unconcealable joy on his face. He found it. Nie Tian frowned and immediately knew that Xian Zongfeng had found the breath of the blood-weeping sword infant in Di Shi Tian's body. Xian Zongfeng's expression at the moment was very funny and excited, as if he had just been sent to hell and then ascended to heaven. Blood-weeping sword infant, blood-weeping sword infant, blood-weeping sword infant is actually in Sakura's body. Xian Zongfeng shouted in excitement. His body could not stop trembling. His old face was filled with a smile, like a blooming chrysanthemum. Only now did he understand why the blood-weeping sword infant within Lien Wui's body had disappeared. It had been transferred to Sakura's body. He didn't know how Nie Tian did it, but it made him feel extremely excited. Xian Zongfeng had always wanted to plant a blood-weeping sword infant in Sakura's body because the latter's sword skills were too strong. Unfortunately, he never had the chance to make a move. Moreover, it was very difficult to plant the blood-weeping sword infant seed on a swordsman like Sakura Heaven. Xian Zongfeng was about to give up, but who would have thought that God had prepared such a big surprise for him? In his opinion, Sakura was much more important than Lien Dai. "Sir Master Wu, are you very happy?" Sakura Heaven looked at Xian Zongfeng and suddenly asked in a cold tone. He already knew what Xian Zongfeng had done to Lien Wui. It was already very difficult for him to remain calm at this moment. Sakura Heaven was the first Sword Master Wu of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. He didn't expect that a despicable person like Xian Zongfeng could also become Sword Master Wu. This was simply an insult to Sword Master Wu. Xian Zongfeng suddenly sensed the coldness in Sakura Heaven's eyes and immediately calmed down. He forced a smile and said, "Wui is no longer in danger. As her teacher, of course I'm happy." "Oomph." Sakura Heaven sneered and did not hide the disgust in his heart. Xian Zongfeng slightly frowned and said in his heart, Sakura Heaven's attitude suddenly changed. Does he know something too? Previously, Xian Zongfeng had also dealt with Sakura Heaven. Although the latter wasn't warm to him, he definitely wouldn't hate him like now. Xian Zongfeng faintly felt that Sakura Heaven also knew something. "Little brother Shirtian, how can you talk to your teacher like that?" Lien Wui felt very uncomfortable and couldn't help but pull Sakura Heaven. Sakura Heaven looked back at Lien Wui and didn't say anything. Lien Wui still didn't know Xian Zongfeng's true colors, so she respected him like a teacher. "Wui, it's fine." Xian Zongfeng became a good person at this moment and smiled faintly. Master Sakura Heaven is young and can't control his emotions sometimes. It's understandable. Then, Xian Zongfeng's eyes sized up Lien Wui and the corner of his mouth suddenly rose. He thought in his heart, Sakura Heaven, even if you know something, I still have a way to deal with you. I heard that you killed 3 people in a row just for Lien Wui. It seems that Lien Wui is very important to you. Lien Wui, Master's good disciple. If Master has something to ask of you in the future, you definitely won't refuse, right? Xian Zongfeng was really despicable. At this time, he already thought of using Lien Wui to deal with Sakura Heaven. "Little junior sister, are you okay?" At this time, there was a hurried voice outside the small courtyard, and then a figure rushed in. It was Zhou Bufan. Zhou Bufan came to Lien Wui's side and looked her up and down, as if he was afraid that the latter was missing something. "I'm fine." Lien Wui smiled faintly. She didn't even know that she just took a trip to the gates of hell. At this time, the crowd outside the small courtyard suddenly opened up a path, and several figures appeared. The person in the lead was Divine Sword Master Gongsun Xingji. Lien Wui was injured, and even Gongsun Xingji was alarmed. "Wui, are you okay?" Gongsun Xingji's huge figure walked over and looked at Lien Wui with a burning gaze. He quickly scanned her with his divine sense, and after confirming that the latter was fine, he was relieved. "Divine Sword Master, I'm fine." Although Lien Wui's body was very weak, seeing that Gongsun Xingji personally came to see her, she still smiled happily. "It's good that you're fine." Gongsun Xingji nodded, but there was some doubt in his eyes. He felt that the sword aura in Lien Wui's body seemed to have changed, but he couldn't tell what exactly had changed. Then, Gongsun Xingji suddenly looked at Xian Zongfeng, and his face darkened. He directly shouted, "Xian Zongfeng, what's going on? The #1 genius of our Shenwu Sword Pagoda was almost killed. Are your Shenwu sword souls all trash?" "Brother Gongsun, this..." Xian Zongfeng's face turned red, and he was extremely embarrassed. He didn't expect Gongsun Xingji to reprimand him in front of so many people. "Divine Sword Master, this is not teacher's fault. Those men in black are all assassins, and it's very difficult to find them when they hide." Xian Zongfeng was reprimanded, and Lien Wui quickly came to help. Chapter 1968. Xian Zongfeng looked embarrassed after being reprimanded by Gongsun Xingji. He didn't think that Lien Wui's injury would make Gongsun Xingji so angry. When the people outside the courtyard saw this scene, they were also shocked. They all held their breaths and even forgot to breathe. Gongsun Xingji and Xian Zongfeng were the Divine Sword Master and Martial Sword Master respectively. In the eyes of outsiders, there was a difference in status between the two, but it wasn't too big. It was definitely not a strict superior-subordinate relationship. Now, Gongsun Xingji was reprimanding Xian Zongfeng in front of so many people, treating the latter as a subordinate. This confused everyone. What they didn't know was that Xian Zongfeng had always been weak in front of Gongsun Xingji. With the fact that Gongsun Xingji had broken through to the legendary realm of sword and martial arts as one, Xian Zongfeng seemed even weaker. However, under normal circumstances, Gongsun Xingji would save Xian Zongfeng some face. But this time he was really angry. The Evil Edge sword competition being brought forward had already damaged the Shenwu Sword Pagoda's reputation. If the top genius of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda was suddenly killed before the Evil Edge sword competition, and outside of Shenwu City at that, then the Shenwu Sword Pagoda's reputation would definitely hit rock bottom. Gongsun Xingji cared a lot about the Shenwu Sword Pagoda's reputation. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made things difficult for Nie Tian. That was why he was so angry and reprimanded Xian Zongfeng. There were 3 more days until the Evil Edge sword competition. Gongsun Xingji didn't want anything to happen during that time. Gongsun Xingji looked at Xian Zongfeng and said, "Xian Zongfeng, tell your Shenwu sword spirit that this is a special time. Anyone who dares to provoke the Shenwu Sword Pagoda will be killed, no matter who that person is." "Yes." Xian Zongfeng nodded, not even daring to look at Gongsun Xingji's face. Gongsun Xingji glanced at the crowd and waved his hand. "All right, this matter ends here. Lien Wui, have a good rest. The others are dismissed." The crowd dispersed. Gongsun Xingji left with Xian Zongfeng. Di Tian originally wanted to go with Lien Wui, but he was stopped by Nie Tian, who said, "Di Tian, Lien Wui is fine now. In the next few days, she needs to rest well. You don't need to follow her." Sakura was slightly stunned. He still wanted to insist, but when he saw Nie Tian's strange expression, he knew that the latter had something to tell him. So he let Lien Wui leave first. Zhou Bufan followed behind Lien Wui, but the latter was obviously very distant from him. "Nie Tian, what's the matter?" In the small courtyard, Sakura asked directly. Before Tian could say anything, the figure of Fat Cat appeared. A pair of blue eyes stared at Di Tian and said, Di Tian, you have just merged with the blood-weeping sword infant. This deity is very worried. For the next period of time, you should stay in the 9 extremes. This. Di Tian was stunned for a moment, and his expression immediately became awkward. What he was worried about was not himself, but the dancing costume. Don't worry. There is no longer a blood-weeping sword infant in Lian Wui's body. Xian Zongfeng won't do anything to her. Of course, Tian knew what Di Tian was thinking. He smiled and said, You saw Sword Master Gongsuan's attitude towards Lian Wui. At a time like this, no one would dare to harm Lian Wui. Indeed, when Lian Wui was injured, Gongsun Sheng reprimanded Xian Zongfeng. This showed how much he valued Lian Wui. Lian Wui was the #1 genius of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. To a certain extent, she represented the dignity of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. How could Gongsun Sheng let anything happen to her? There would definitely be a large number of powerhouses lurking around Lian Wui to protect her in secret. Okay. Di Tian thought for a moment and finally nodded. Tian opened the 9 extremes and let Di Tian in. This deity will also enter the 9 extremes to take a look. The fat cat chuckled and moved, entering the 9 extremes as well. He wasn't sure what effect the blood-tier sword infant would have on Di Tian. Therefore, he would keep an eye on Di Tian to make sure that nothing bad would happen to the latter. I hope the blood-tier sword infant won't have too much of an effect on Di Tian. Tian frowned and couldn't help but look worried. The blood-tier sword infant could greatly improve a swordsman's sword intent. This made Tian very confused. If Di Tian's sword intent were to improve again, what realm would it be? As far as Tian knew, the legendary realm of the unity of sword and martial arts was the highest realm of Sword Dao. He wasn't sure if there was a higher realm after the legendary realm. Perhaps. Tian sighed inwardly as he felt much more at ease. Whether there was a higher realm after the legendary realm or not, it wasn't something Tian needed to think about because he was still too far away from the unity of sword and martial arts. For Tian, the most important thing was the Evil Edge Sword Discourse. The Evil Edge Sword Discourse hadn't started yet, but all the geniuses had their eyes on Tian. The Divine Martial Sword Pagoda's demon swordsman Zhuobu Fan, the Xianyuan family swordsman, and the Jiang family's Jiang Yuji all publicly declared that they wanted to challenge Tian. However, Tian didn't care. Among the three, only the swordsman from the Xianyuan family gave Tian a headache. He didn't care about the other two at all. Tian was more worried that the Evil Edge Sword Discourse had caused too much of a commotion. He was afraid that organizations like the Holy Parliament and the Nets Above Snares Below already knew about it. He was worried that these organizations would send powerful swordsmen. It seems like it won't be easy to become the champion of the Evil Edge Sword Discourse. Tian shook his head and sighed in his heart. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but this was his own choice. Even if he had to step on blood, he had to finish it. 3 days later, Tian stood in his courtyard, flanked by Jian Jingyun and Gue Wushan. Congratulations on reaching the paramount god level, Jian Jingyun, Gue Wuzan, Tian said, looking at them with a happy expression. After 3 months of secluded meditation, Jian Jingyun and Gue Wushan had reached the early paramount god level. That level of strength was far from being considered the strongest in the 9 realms, but considering Jian Jingyun and Gue Wushan, it was a shocking achievement. After all, neither of them were even 10,000 years old. In the 9 realms, people who could reach the paramount god level before the age of 10,000 were as rare as phoenix feathers or Qilin horns. It's all thanks to you, Gue Wushan said, laughing heartily. You took us to the path of slaughter. Neither he nor Jian Jingyun could ever have imagined that they would reach the paramount god level so quickly. Back when Jian Jingyun and Gue Wushan had been on the path of slaughter, their martial bodies and talent had improved significantly. That was one of the reasons they had been able to reach the paramount god level so quickly. The power of the path of slaughter is important, Tian said with a faint smile. but your talent and willpower are the most important. All of a sudden, he thought about Rui Qinyu. Rui Qinyu had been fusing with the path of slaughter for several months now, and it was almost time for the process to end. Chapter 1969. It was almost time for Rui Qinyu to successfully integrate the path of massacre. Nie Tian was not in a hurry. Nie Tian, let's go, Gue Wuchan said with a smile. He could not wait any longer. The three of them did not delay any further and headed straight for the Evil Edge Ocean. At the same time, the Evil Edge Ocean was filled with a sea of people. Today was the first day of the Evil Edge Sword Duel. It was held early, so it naturally attracted more attention than the previous duels. Almost all the swordsmen from the 9 domains who had some ability and met the requirements to participate had arrived. At a glance, the entire Evil Edge Ocean was filled with endless crowds. At this moment, there were several figures standing on a high platform in the Evil Edge Ocean's viewing area. Each of them had a powerful aura that was as vast as the ocean. These people were the top experts from the 9 domains. They were Gongsun Shengji, Xian Zongfeng, Guiwu Guangsha, Jiang Su, Jian Lufeng, and Xianyuan Heoda. The 6 of them were the hosts of this Evil Edge Sword Duel. Gongsun Shengji and Xian Zongfeng were the hosts of the Divine Martial Sword Duel, so it was natural for them to be the hosts. The other 4 were from other forces. On one hand, it was to show respect to the other forces, and on the other hand, it was to show the fairness of the Evil Edge Sword Duel. Jiang Su was the first to speak. He looked at Xian Zongfeng and asked, Swordmaster Wu, I heard that there are 60,000 participants this time. Is this true? Xian Zongfeng nodded with a smile. There are indeed 60,000 to 70,000 participants this time. I didn't expect so many people to participate. The Evil Edge Sword Duel has been brought forward, but there are more participants. Interesting. Jiang Su smiled and did not speak further. After a moment of silence, the Jin clan's Jian Lufeng smiled and said, Dear Sword Masters, although there are many participants in the Evil Peak Sword competition, it was held several thousand years in advance. Many sword prodigies have yet to mature. I don't think there will be any stunning sword prodigies in this competition, right? Jian Lufeng was a short and fat old man with a goatee. He always twirled his beard when he spoke. Brother Lufeng, you worry too much. Gongsun Sheng smiled and said, I don't dare to speak about other swordsmen, but there is one swordsman whose strength is beyond everyone's imagination. He will definitely shock all of you. Oh, Jian Lufeng couldn't help but be taken aback. Shortly after, he smiled and said, This swordsman must be an incredible genius to be able to receive such an evaluation from the Divine Swordmaster. I wonder who he is? He is none other than the one who forced the Evil Edge Sword Duel to be held in advance, Nie Tian. Gongsun Sheng spoke in a low voice while a wisp of a complicated expression surged in his eyes. No one knew what he'd thought of. Nie Tian. Hearing this name, the other 5 couldn't help but cry out at the same time, but the expressions on their faces were different. Jian Lufeng, Jiang Su, Xianyuan Heoda, and the rest were all shocked. They didn't expect Gongsun Sheng to have such a high evaluation of Nie Tian. However, Guiwu Guangsha and Xian Zongfeng looked puzzled. Both of them knew how terrifying Nie Tian was, but they didn't expect Gongsun Sheng to actually show such an admiring attitude towards Nie Tian. Shouldn't Gongsun Sheng hate Nie Tian to the bone? Why'd he suddenly change his attitude? In fact, Gongsun Sheng's change of attitude towards Nie Tian was not very sudden. Although Nie Tian had forced the Evil Edge Sword Duel to be brought forward, which made Gongsun Sheng feel provoked, he had to admit that Nie Tian's strength was indeed unimaginably strong. In the past few months, Third Lady Gongsun had been talking to Gongsun Sheng about Nie Tian, which made Gongsun Sheng's attitude towards Nie Tian change a little. A few days ago, Nie Tian saved Lien Wui, which made the hatred in Gongsun Sheng's heart gradually disappear, replaced by admiration. Lord Divine Sword Master, I heard that Nie Tian is a higher god swordsman. Is that true? After a while, they calmed down, and Xianyuan Heoda, who had been silent all this time, suddenly asked. Xianyuan Heoda was from a Xianyuan clan. and he was also a famous swordsman. His strength was no less than Guiwu Guangsha. Yes. Gong Sun Sheng nodded lightly, then laughed and said, Brother Xin Yuan, if you look down on Ye Tian because of his strength, then you're making a big mistake. His battle prowess definitely can't be measured by cultivation. Gong Sun Sheng had a deep understanding of Nye Tian's battle strength. He had seen Nye Tian kill a mid-stage paramount god with his own eyes. So that's how it is. It seems that Yun Song has a strong opponent this time. Xin Yuan Heoda nodded slightly, the corners of his mouth unconsciously revealing a strange smile. Brother Xin Yuan, the Xin Yuan Yun Song you mentioned has already fought with Nye Tian. He is indeed a strong opponent for Nye Tian. Guiwu Guangsha suddenly looked at Xin Yuan Heoda and said with a playful tone, the Yun Song that Xin Yuan Heoda mentioned was Xin Yuan Yun Song. He was very arrogant and had publicly provoked Nye Tian. His sword intent was very sharp. After Nye Tian received a blow from Xin Yuan Yun Song, the latter arrogantly said that Nye Tian was qualified to be his opponent. When Xin Yuan Yun Song and Nye Tian fought, Guiwu Guangsha was present. Although Guiwu Guangsha didn't have a good impression of Xin Yuan Yun Song, he had to admit that Xin Yuan Yun Song was strong enough to pose a threat to Nye Tian. The swordsmen of the Xin Yuan family have always been strong. Gong Sun Shengji smiled faintly, and then said, however, in terms of talent and swordsmanship, I believe that no one can compare to Nye Tian. When Xin Yuan Heoda heard Gong Sun Shengji's words, he couldn't help but frown, and his face turned a little ugly. The others were surprised and shocked. Gong Sun Shengji's evaluation of Nye Tian was getting higher and higher. Brother Gong Sun, could it be that even Lord Di Shi Tian's talent can't compare to Nye Tian? Xian Zongfeng's eyes flickered, and he couldn't help but ask. In his opinion, Di Shi Tian was a real monster in swordsmanship. That kind of talent was simply not something a normal human could have. The corner of Gong Sun Shengji's mouth twitched, and his gaze was a little strange. He said, Brother Zongfeng, do you really think that Di Shi Tian is only 6 or 7 years old? What do you mean? Xian Zongfeng was stunned, and his face stiffened. Nothing. Gong Sun Shengji didn't want to say more, and waved his hand perfunctorily. He had only met Di Shi Tian a few times, but he could see that the latter was definitely hiding a big secret. However, Gong Sun Shengji was a smart person. He knew that some things could be done, and some things could not be done. No matter what happened to Di Shi Tian, it was his own business. It had nothing to do with Gong Sun Shengji, so he naturally wouldn't ask. The others knew that Gong Sun Shengji's words had a hidden meaning, but the latter didn't want to say more, so they couldn't force him. Boom! At this moment, the void suddenly shook. Chapter 1970. Boom! Above the sky, the huge rock pressed down on the void, and a mighty rumbling sound came from the sky. What is that? The crowd looked at the boulder, their voices trembling. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. By then, Nye Tian and the others had arrived. They stared at the boulder in astonishment. Nye Tian's eyes shone like torches. He sent his divine sense over and saw that the boulder was surrounded by violent sword intent. The surface of the boulder was engraved with strange runes that gave off a mysterious aura. The boulder was 10,000 meters long and 2,000 meters wide. It was hard to imagine what kind of power was needed to make such a huge boulder fly in the air. Look, there's someone there. Someone shouted when they saw someone on the boulder. Nye Tian was stunned for a moment. Only then did he see that there were actually dozens of swordsmen standing on top of the boulder. Moreover, their positions were very orderly, standing at the important positions of the boulder. Every swordsman was releasing their sword intent with all their might. It was their sword intent that made the boulder fly in the air. These swordsmen are so strong. They're all paramount gods. Nye Tian frowned when he realized that all of the swordsmen were paramount gods. When he first entered the god awakening realm, the peak over gods were the paragons of the aristocratic families. At that time, he had thought that paramount gods were unreachable existences. But now he was strong enough to kill paramount gods in an instant. Most of the people he had met were paramount gods. Although they were both part of the 9 realms, the God-awakening realm of the 3 lower realms was vastly different from the realms of the 3 upper realms. It was like the difference between the 3,000 lesser realms and the Sumeru realm, is that the legendary divine martial sword stone. Gue Wuxian seemed to have thought of something and couldn't help but exclaim, "It should be." Jian Jingyan nodded, his eyes shining. "Divine martial sword stone? What is it?" Nie Tian went blank for a moment before asking in astonishment. The divine martial sword stone is the divine martial sword pagoda's divine martial supreme treasure. Legend has it that it is a saint stone from the immemorial era. It contains a powerful saint's power and is extremely terrifying. Jian Jingyan looked at the giant stone in the sky and said, "Every time the Evil Edge Sword Seminar is held, the divine martial sword stone will be brought out. On one hand, it is to show the power of the divine martial sword pagoda to the world. On the other hand, it is used to test the participants of the Evil Edge Sword Seminar." "I see." Nie Tian nodded and asked, "How does the divine martial sword stone test the swordsman?" Jian Jingyan laughed and replied, "The divine martial sword stone will be placed in the sword formation. All the participants of the Evil Edge Sword competition can use their sword intent to attack the divine martial sword stone. As long as they can leave a sword mark on the stone, they will pass. Otherwise, they will be eliminated." "So easy." After hearing Jian Jingyan's words, Gue Wukan couldn't help but let out a strange cry and said, "As long as a swordsman has a little bit of strength, they can destroy a mountain with a single sword strike. Leaving a sword mark on a rock, this kind of testing method, is too simple. You underestimate the divine martial sword stone too much." Jian Jingyan glanced at Gue Wukan and smiled. "It's rumored that the divine martial sword stone is a meteorite from another world. It's extremely tough, and it's impossible for swordsmen below over God to leave a sword mark on it. What's even stranger is that there are mysterious sword inscriptions on the divine martial sword stone. It's an extremely unique defense, and it's a test of a swordsman's sword intent. The swordsman's sword intent needs to be powerful enough to break through the defense of the sword inscriptions and leave a sword mark on the stone. It's that strange." Gue Wukan curled his lips as if he was in disbelief. As Nie Tian and the others spoke, the divine martial sword stone descended and landed in a formation in the sky. It was firmly fixed in the air by the formation. From afar, it seemed like a floating mountain. Everyone's gazes were gathered on the divine martial sword stone. Their expressions were strange and excited. A while later, a black-clothed old man appeared. He said with a deep voice, "Swordsman, welcome to the Evil Edge Ocean." The old man's voice wasn't loud, but it was mighty and could be clearly heard by everyone. After that, the black-clothed old man chatted for a while before introducing the process of the Evil Edge Sword competition. The entire Evil Edge Sword competition was divided into 3 parts: the Sword Stone test, the Swordsman competition, and the Sword Chief competition. The Sword Stone test was to first use the divine martial sword stone to eliminate a portion of the swordsman. The swordsman competition was a battle of points between the participants to determine the top 16 swordsmen. The final Sword Chief competition was the pinnacle battle between the top 16 swordsmen. The Sword Stone test will begin soon. All participating swordsmen can attack the divine martial sword stone, but you must leave a sword mark on the stone in order to pass. Otherwise, you'll be eliminated immediately. Now, let me give you a demonstration." As the black-robed old man spoke, he moved and arrived before the divine martial sword stone. With a slight movement of his body, a sword will whistled out and bombarded the sword stone. A sword mark that was several meters long appeared. However, it flashed and disappeared in an instant. After doing all that, the black-clothed old man smiled and said, "As long as you can do that, you'll pass and receive your challenge token. Otherwise, you'll fail and be eliminated immediately. Now, let's begin." "What's so difficult about that? Let me go first." Before the black-clothed old man could finish his sentence, a voice was heard. Then a figure dashed out and swung his sword. A sword shadow dashed towards the divine martial sword stone in the air. The sword shadow was as majestic as a mountain. This sword could destroy at least a small mountain. The crowd stared at the divine martial sword stone, curious about what would happen next. Just as the sword shadow was about 100 meters away from the divine martial sword stone, something strange happened. Boom! The sword shadow shook and suddenly collapsed. It turned into sword intent and was absorbed by the divine martial sword stone. What's going on? The sudden scene caused everyone to suck in a breath of cold air. They didn't know what was going on. This person's sword shadow was very powerful. It didn't even get within 100 meters of the divine martial sword stone before it collapsed. This was too strange. At this moment, the crowd finally understood how terrifying the sword intent that the black-clothed old man had casually swung out was. So strange? I'll try again. That person wasn't convinced. Sword aura rose from his body, and he wanted to attack again. Get lost. However, at that moment, a thunderous voice rang out, and a sword will descended from the sky, directly descending on that person. Instantly, a blood-colored trail fell from the sky, smashing into the ground. Gasp! Everyone was stunned and gasped. They looked at the person who attacked. It was the black-clothed old man. I'll say it again. Everyone only has one chance. If you fail, you'll be eliminated immediately. If anyone dares to break the rules of the competition, this person will be the example. The black-clothed old man shouted coldly as he glanced at everyone with a murderous look. Everyone was shocked. They didn't dare to underestimate the divine martial sword stone anymore. Because of that person's failure, no one dared to step out and try. Everyone was watching. Isn't it just the divine martial sword stone? Let me try. Just then, an arrogant voice was heard. A figure appeared in midair with a faint smile on his face. Chapter 1971. Facing the strange divine martial sword stone, everyone was hesitant and did not dare to rashly try. Gue Wuchan's sudden appearance in front of everyone seemed very bold and even a little arrogant. Who is this guy? He's so arrogant. He's just a fool who doesn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. He's probably crazy because he wants to be in the limelight. I don't think this kid is much. I can tell he's just cannon fodder. Everyone looked at Gue Wuchan in disgust. Their words were more unpleasant than the previous one. Gue Wuchan's face turned extremely ugly when he heard everyone's evaluation of him. He could only say in his heart, "A bunch of fools. You'll see how powerful I am soon." Jian Jingyan looked at Gue Wuchan from afar and said worriedly, "Isn't it too reckless for Gue Wuchan to run up like this?" "It's fine." Nie Tian's reaction was very calm as he smiled faintly. Gue Wuchan's strength was top-notch among all the martial artists who participated in the Evil Peak Sword competition. Nie Tian believed that Gue Wuchan could definitely leave a sword mark on the divine martial sword stone. At this moment, Gue Wuchan's figure moved. He was very cautious as he stared at the divine martial sword stone. An 8 desolate ghost martial appeared in his hand, and a mighty sword aura surged from his body. With a slash, a sword nascent soul immediately bombarded the divine martial sword stone. Boom! Everyone's eyes widened as they saw a sword mark that was several meters long appear on the huge divine martial sword stone. A sword mark has appeared. Everyone's expression changed as they couldn't help but exclaim. Many people's eyes were wide open as they couldn't believe the scene in front of them. Gue Wuchan's performance ever since he appeared was like a fool. Who would have thought that he would be so powerful? I used all my strength, but I only managed to leave such a small mark on the divine martial sword stone. It's really embarrassing, Gue Musashi said with a frown as he looked at the mark that flashed by. He was extremely dissatisfied. Although he had shocked everyone by leaving a sword mark on the divine martial sword stone, he was clearly not satisfied with his performance. Gue Wuchan originally thought that his sword strike would at least leave a sword mark 100 meters long. He didn't expect that it would only leave a sword mark several meters long. The divine martial sword stone was indeed very strange. Gue Wuchan returned with a dejected look on his face. Looking at Nie Tian and Jian Jingyun, he could not help but twitch his mouth, a helpless look on his face. "It's fine. You're already doing very well." Nie Tian smiled faintly. Then, he focused his attention on the divine martial swordstone with a slightly shocked expression. He did not expect the divine martial swordstone's defense to be so strange. Guo Wuchan was an early paramount god, and on top of that, he had reached the sword oblivion level. His battle prowess was comparable to that of a mid-paramount god. But even so, his all-out strike only left a sword mark that was a few meters long. This result was really strange. If it was an ordinary boulder, a single slash from Guo Wuchan would be sufficient to shatter it into smithereens. Divine martial swordstone, interesting. Nie Tian sensed the mysterious runes around the divine martial swordstone and found it even stranger. He couldn't help but smile and murmur. Guo Wuchan's success in leaving a sword mark on the divine martial swordstone caused the other participants to immediately become restless. Then, many people flew up at the same time and attacked the divine martial swordstone with sword intent. However, it was a pity that the majority of people weren't able to leave a sword mark on the swordstone. As for those who were able to leave a sword mark, they were only able to leave a sword mark that was almost undetectable. Compared to Guo Wuchan, they were far inferior. Haha, so I'm this powerful. Guo Wuchan could not help but laugh when he saw everyone's reaction. Nie Tian and Jin Jingyan looked at each other and smiled faintly. So far, no one had a better result than Guo Wuchan. Guo Wuchan was indeed powerful. A few moments later, thousands of people had taken the swordstone test, but no one had a better result than Guo Wuchan. A bunch of idiots. Let me try. At this moment, an arrogant voice suddenly rang out, resounding in the void. It was extremely ear-piercing. Boom! Before the voice died away, a sword aura appeared like a dragon, rolling in the air and forcing many swordsmen who were preparing to take the test to step back. This person is so arrogant. The eyes of the crowd trembled as they looked at the figure that suddenly appeared and couldn't help but say, "It's that idiot again." Nie Tian saw the figure's face clearly, but he shook his head with a disdainful smile. Nie Tian was no stranger to this arrogant person. He was a swordsman of the Jiang family, Jiang Yuji. Jiang Yuji had fought with Nie Tian before, but he was no match for the latter. This guy had almost died in the hands of Nie Tian. It had only been a few days, but he was so arrogant again. What idiot! At this time, the others also recognized Jiang Yuji's identity and couldn't help but step back. Jiang Yuji was not weak, and he was a member of the Jiang family. Of course, no one was willing to provoke him. A bunch of trash. I'll let you see what a real swordsman is. Jiang Yuji sneered, and then sword intent surged from his entire body. He emanated an extremely fierce aura as he suddenly stabbed out with his sword. The brilliance of the sword blossomed in midair, and then it transformed into a sword shadow that whistled out. The sword shadow was like the wind and lightning. It was so fast that it seemed to have directly descended on the divine martial swordstone. Boom! The divine martial swordstone suddenly shook, and suddenly, a sword mark of about 10 meters appeared. Like a flowing light, it quickly disappeared. So powerful. The eyes of the crowd trembled when they saw this scene, and they couldn't help but cry out in surprise. It had to be said that Jiang Yuji's sword was indeed very terrifying. It actually left a sword mark of 10 meters on the divine martial sword stone, which was much more terrifying than Guo Wuchan's. Damn, this guy is even more powerful than me. Guo Wuchan screamed and looked at Jiang Yuji with an unconvinced expression. Nie Tian smiled faintly. He wasn't surprised at all. Jiang Yuji's strength was originally above Guo Wuchan's, so it was reasonable that he could leave a bigger sword mark. A bunch of idiots. Did you see it clearly? This is a real swordsman. Jiang Yuji was very arrogant. He shouted wildly, and at the same time, his eyes swept over and locked on to Nie Tian. The provocation was very obvious. Nie Tian, however, twitched the corner of his mouth and completely ignored Jiang Yuji. Jiang Yuji was too weak. There was no need for Nie Tian to take him seriously. Humph! At this time, a cold voice sounded. It's just a sword mark of 10 meters. Do you need to be so arrogant? Jiang Yulong was stunned for a moment. Then, he looked in the direction of the voice. When he saw the face of the person who spoke, he smiled cold and said, "Zhuo Bufan, you really talk big. I want to see how big a sword mark you can leave. It must be bigger than yours." Zhuo Bufan's eyes were fierce. After a low shout, he directly blasted out with his sword. The sword's shadow whistled toward the giant stone in the air. Chapter 1972. Rumble. Under countless gazes, a sword image slammed into the divine martial swordstone like a huge dragon. The impact left a 40-meter-long mark on the divine martial swordstone. So powerful. When the crowd saw this scene, their expressions changed, and they immediately cried out in surprise. What was even stranger was that the sword mark that was 30 to 40 meters long did not disappear in a flash. Instead, it stayed there for a few seconds before disappearing. When the mark disappeared completely, the crowd was in an uproar. No wonder Zhuo Bufan is one of the top 3 geniuses of the divine martial sword pagoda. That sword is so powerful. Yeah, that mark was 40 meters long. Zhuo Bufan's strength is far above Jiang Yuji's. The swordsmen of the divine martial sword pagoda are really something. Zhuo Bufan heard the crowd's discussion and couldn't help but look pleased. He was clearly enjoying it. "Jiang Yuji, did you see that? That's a real swordsman," Zhuo Bufan said provocatively, his eyes on Jiang Yuji. Jiang Yuji had said the same thing just now, looking down on all the other swordsmen. But now, he was being looked down upon by Zhuo Bufan. "Isn't it just a little bigger than mine? Do you have to be so arrogant?" The evil-edged sword discourse is a competition of sword Dao. A mere swordstone test doesn't mean anything. If we fight to the death, it's hard to say who will live and who will die. Jiang Yuji looked at Zhuo Bufan and said coldly. Zhuo Bufan curled his lips and said with a playful smile, "Then I look forward to fighting you." "Oomph." Jiang Yuji snorted coldly and turned to leave. The commotion caused by Zhuo Bufan took a long time to die down. Then, all the other participants continued with the test. Half a day later, the tens of thousands of swordsmen had passed the test. Less than a tenth of them had passed, and the rest had been eliminated. None of the swordsmen who had passed the test had reached Zhuo Bufan's level. Even Jian Jingyun, Xing Wuji, and the others hadn't been able to surpass Zhuo Bufan. Only Lian Wui had managed to create a mark on the same level as Zhuo Bufan. After Zhuo Bufan became an early-stage paramount god, his sword intent wasn't any weaker than Lian Wui's. At this time, only a small portion of people did not participate in the test. Nie Tian smiled faintly and took a step forward, ready to take the test. At this moment, he was already very familiar with the divine martial swordstone. Not only did it test the swordsman's sword Dao strength, but it also tested the quality of the swordsman's sword intent. In other words, so long as one sword insight was formidable enough, then one would be able to easily break open the talisman markings on the swordstone. Nie Tian was very confident in the quality of his sword intent, but he didn't want to cause too much of a commotion. Therefore, he planned to use a casual sword move, as long as he didn't get eliminated. "Nie Tian, you're finally ready to act." However, just as Nie Tian stepped out, a very unfriendly voice rang out. A pair of cold eyes stared at Nie Tian, full of provocation. "It's you." When Nie Tian saw that face, he immediately recognized it as the swordsman from the Xianyuan clan, Xianyuan Yinsong. From the looks of it, Xianyuan Yinsong had been waiting for Nie Tian to make a move. "My name is Xianyuan Yinsong." Xianyuan Yinsong looked up at Nie Tian and said in a loud voice, "Nie Tian, I'm going to show everyone who's the strongest genius in the art of the sword today." Nie Tian was stunned. He didn't understand what Xianyuan Yinsong was trying to do. Everyone else looked at him strangely as well. They didn't know what Xianyuan Yinsong was trying to do. "Nie Tian, I want to make a bet with you." Xianyuan Yinsong looked at Nie Tian and said loudly, "A bet? What are we betting on?" Nie Tian was taken aback for a moment before a faint smile appeared on his face. "Let's bet on who will win and who will lose in this swordstone test." Xianyuan Yinsong glanced at the divine martial swordstone and said coldly, "So what if I win? So what if I lose?" Nie Tian raised his eyebrows with a playful expression. Xianyuan Yinsong revealed a strange smile and said, "Let's bet on this evil-edged sword competition." The loser will directly withdraw from the evil edge sword competition. Do you dare? Hmm? When Yetan heard Xianyuan Yunsong's words, his eyes narrowed. This bet was something he didn't expect. Xianyuan Yunsong wanted to defeat Nietian too much. He wanted to prove himself too much. Hence, he made a big bet with Nietian. Both of them were sword Dao geniuses. The evil edge sword competition had an extraordinary meaning to them, especially to Nietian. The evil edge sword competition was very important. This was his method to rescue the Sword Elder. This bet was indeed very big for Nietian. The surrounding people were also stunned. They looked at Nietian and Xianyuan Yunsong in astonishment. On the viewing platform, Gongsun Xingji and the rest had a change of expression. No one would have thought that Xianyuan Yunsong would actually propose such a bet to Nietian during the Swordstone test. Guiwu Quangsha was the first to be unable to endure it. He frowned and said to Xianyuan Lufeng, "Brother Lufeng, what Xianyuan Yunsong is doing is a little inappropriate." Xianyuan Lufeng laughed. He stroked his goatee and said, "What Yunsong does is his own business. Moreover, Nietian has the right to refuse. If he's afraid, then he can just admit defeat." Guiwu Quangsha frowned, and his face turned gloomy. Xianyuan Yunsong provoked Nietian in front of so many people. If Nietian refused, it would be the same as announcing to everyone that he, Nietian, was afraid of Xianyuan Yunsong. Nietian's character was unyielding. He wasn't afraid of anything. How could he admit defeat in front of Xianyuan Yunsong? "Nietian, I'm not the kind of person who forces others against their will. If you're afraid, then forget it." Xianyuan Yunsong saw that Nietian was still hesitating. He couldn't help but provoke again. His attitude was extremely arrogant. Afraid? Suddenly, Nietian smiled. His smile was extremely strange. He suddenly looked at Xianyuan Yunsong and said in a clear voice, "I'm indeed afraid. But I'm not afraid of losing. I'm afraid that this bet is too small. It's not worth it." Eh? Xianyuan Yunsong was stunned. He only reacted after a long time. He asked, "Nietian, what do you mean?" "Xianyuan Yunsong, since you want to bet, then we might as well make the bet a little bigger." The corner of Nietian's mouth rose. He faintly smiled and said, "The person who loses the Swordstone test not only has to withdraw from the Evil Peak Sword competition, but he also has to unconditionally promise the winner 3 things. This, Xianyuan Yunsong was stunned again. He didn't know what to say. The bet Nietian was talking about was indeed very big. 3 unconditionally promises. Didn't that mean that the winner wanted the loser to die, and the loser had no right to refuse? This time, it was Xianyuan Yunsong's turn to hesitate. He really couldn't figure out where Nietian got his confidence from. How dare he make such a big bet? Last time, when Nietian fought with Xianyuan Yunsong, although Nietian managed to block the latter sword attack, he was still at a disadvantage. Right now, he dared to make such a big bet with Xianyuan Yunsong. It was indeed very courageous. "Xianyuan Yunsong, I'm not the kind of person who forces others against their will. If you're afraid, then forget it." Nietian looked at Xianyuan Yunsong and said lightly. Chapter 1973. As Nietian's voice faded, everyone's gaze focused on Xianyuan Yunsong, waiting for the latter to make his decision. Xianyuan Yunsong's expression was extremely unsightly. Beads of sweat the size of beans seeped out of his forehead, and he even started to regret bringing up this bet with Nietian. He didn't know what kind of trump card Nietian had, so he felt extremely guilty in his heart. "Xianyuan Yunsong, have you made up your mind?" The corner of Nietian's mouth pulled into a playful smile, appearing extremely arrogant. At this moment, the surrounding spectators couldn't bear to watch any longer and started to discuss. "Xianyuan Yunsong is too cowardly. He wanted to bet with Nietian, but Nietian increased the bet, yet he doesn't dare to bet anymore. What the hell is this?" That's right, a coward still wants to act like a big shot. If you don't dare to bet, then say so earlier. Don't waste everyone's time. No wonder the Xianyuan family is living in seclusion. With this kind of family disciple, it's embarrassing to come out. The crowd's comments were more vicious than the previous, and when they fell into Xianyuan Yunsong's ears, they were like steel needles, piercing into his heart. At this moment, on the viewing platform, the expressions of Gouwu Kwangsha and Xinyuan Lufeng changed, especially Xinyuan Lufeng. His face was waxy yellow, as if he had eaten shit, no longer having the arrogance from before. He also couldn't understand why Nie Tian was so confident to actually propose such a bet condition. Gouwu Kwangsha's complexion was also not good. He felt that Nie Tian was too impulsive and shouldn't have said such words. Only Gongsun Shengji had a faint smile on his face. He was extremely satisfied and didn't have the slightest bit of nervousness. He didn't know why, but he was extremely confident in Nie Tian. He always felt that anything that happened in Nie Tian wouldn't be strange. Fine, I'll bet. Right at this moment, a furious roar resounded. Xinyuan Yinsong looked up at Nie Tian and shouted, Nie Tian, I, Xinyuan Yinsong, would like to see exactly what trump card you have to actually dare to act so arrogantly. My trump cards are beyond your imagination. Hearing Xinyuan Yinsong's reply, Nie Tian replied with a faint smile on his face. Nie Tian was a strong person, but he was definitely not reckless. Since he dared to make such a big bet with Xinyuan Yinsong, he was confident that he would win. Xinyuan Yinsong, you go first. Nie Tian smiled faintly and signaled Xinyuan Yinsong to go first. Xinyuan Yinsong was stunned for a moment. He took a step forward, but he stopped and said, Nie Tian, you go first. Me first? Nie Tian laughed and said, Xinyuan Yinsong, I'm afraid that if I go first, you won't even have the courage to draw your sword. What do you mean? Xinyuan Yinsong frowned. He didn't know why, but the more he looked at Nie Tian, the more afraid he felt. Nie Tian smiled faintly and said, when my sword falls, I'll crush you and destroy the last bit of courage in your heart. His eyes were brimming with confidence that made people's hair stand on end. Nie Tian, you are too arrogant. Xinyuan Yinsong shouted angrily. However, he was already regretting his impulsive decision to agree to Nie Tian's bet. However, it was too late to say anything now. He could only brace himself and go first. Nie Tian, Xinyuan Yinsong, why don't you two go together? The godly martial swordstone is big enough. Someone suggested at this moment. Right, let's go together. Everyone agreed. The crowd was thunderous. Everyone was very curious as to who would win this special competition. One was a peerless genius. The other was a genius swordsman from a hidden family. The battle between the two would definitely be spectacular. However, what was more exciting than the battle itself was the shocking wager. All right, let's attack together then. Nie Tian smiled faintly. Then he blurred into action, putting some distance between himself and Xinyuan Yinsong. Xinyuan Yinsong took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. He knew that the more nervous he was, the worse it would be. Xinyuan Yinsong was very confident in his abilities. However, he couldn't understand the godly martial swordstone at all, so he was worried that there was something strange about it. Xinyuan Yinsong, are you ready? Nie Tian smiled faintly. He turned around and asked Xinyuan Yinsong provocatively. Xinyuan Yinsong's face darkened. The calmer Nie Tian was, the more worried he was. Nie Tian looked away, and his face became serious. The sword intent inside his body began to surge. This bet was extremely important to him. If he lost, he would not be able to bear the consequences. Therefore, Nie Tian had to win. He had to win beautifully and indisputably. With that thought, Nie Tian did not hesitate anymore. The origin of the demon and celestial demons inside his body began to operate. Waves of demon and celestial force were released and merged with the sword intent inside his body. At this moment, Nie Tian's entire body released a piercingly cold sword aura, causing him to look like a sharp sword that could tear the heavens and the earth apart. What a terrifying sword aura! The crowd was tens of thousands of meters away, but they could still feel the sharp sword aura that Nie Tian released. They could not help but tremble. It was as if even their souls were trembling. The sword aura that Nie Tian released was too strange. It gave people a very real sense of oppression. Gongsun Xingji and the others on the viewing platform also felt the sharpness of Nie Tian's sword aura. Their expressions changed dramatically. They were terrified. Gongsun Xingji's eyes were filled with astonishment and shock. At that moment, he felt a very terrifying but completely unfamiliar sword intent aura from Tian's sword aura. It was so strange that Gongsun Xingji could not accept it at all. No matter how terrifying Tian was, it was impossible for him to change the aura of his sword intent all of a sudden. One had to admit that Gongsun Xingji's feeling was right. Tian was indeed using a brand new sword intent, the Celestial Demon Sword Intent. The Celestial Demon Sword Intent was formed by the combination of 5 sword intents and some unknown force. It was terrifying, and Tian had never used it before. He could tell that the higher the quality of the sword intent, the greater the impact on the divine martial sword stone. In order to be sure, Tian decided to use the Celestial Demon Sword Intent. At this moment, Xianyuan Yunsong's figure suddenly moved. He slashed out with his sword. The sword was extremely sharp. It flashed in the sky and landed on the divine martial sword stone. Rumble! At that moment, the divine martial sword stone let out a loud rumble. Then, a sword mark that was 100 meters long appeared and exploded on the stone. It was extremely dazzling. Ha! A sword mark that was 100 meters long. Xianyuan Yunsong looked at the sword mark and could not help but laugh. He had created a sword mark that was 100 meters long with one attack. It had far surpassed the previous best record. Victory seemed to be at his fingertips. How could Xianyuan Yunsong not be happy? Boom! At that moment, Tian's sword shadow whizzed out and landed on the divine martial sword stone. Suddenly, a sword mark appeared. It exploded at the center and spread wildly to both sides. Chapter 1974. Boom! On the godly martial sword stone, Tian swung his sword. The sword exploded and spread to both sides. Countless people stared at the exploding sword mark. Their hearts were in their throats. Xianyuan Yunsong's eyes were also fixed on it, not daring to blink. However, what happened next made his face stiffen. Crack, crack, crack. As the rune defense on the godly martial sword stone was destroyed, the sword mark exploded uncontrollably. 50 meters, 100 meters, 500 meters, 1,000 meters. Under everyone's incredulous gaze, the sword mark reached its limit in an instant. It was 1,000 meters long. A 1,000-meter-long sword mark appeared on the godly martial sword stone. Everyone's eyes widened and their expressions stiffened. They were shocked to the extreme. There were 60 to 70,000 swordsmen who participated in the Evil Edge sword competition, but only 5,000 passed the test. That was less than 1/10 of the total number of people. The passing rate didn't seem low, but these 60 to 70,000 swordsmen were genius swordsmen from the 9 major realms. It was easy to imagine how difficult the godly martial swordstone test was. Most of the swordsmen who passed the test could only leave a sword mark that was a few meters long on the swordstone. The more talented swordsmen could only leave a sword mark that was around 10 meters long. Even a top-notch swordsman like Jiang Yuji could only leave a sword mark that was 30 to 40 meters long. Xianyuan Yunsong was definitely one of the rarest swordsmen in the competition. The fact that he could leave a sword mark that was 100 meters long on the godly martial swordstone was already shocking enough. However, the sword mark that Tian left on the godly martial swordstone was 1,000 meters long. It was 10 times more powerful than Xianyuan Yunsong's. It was easy to imagine how shocking it was. This is ridiculous. Even Tian was stunned when he saw this. He didn't expect the power of the sword to be so great. It seemed like the godly demon sword had a strong destructive power against the rune on the godly martial sword stone. It could easily break through the rune defense. Tian was stunned for a few seconds before he came back to his senses. A faint smile appeared on his face. On the viewing platform high up in the sky, Gongsun Xingji and the others were all dumbfounded. It was as if they were collectively petrified, unable to react for a long time. Gongsun Sheng knew how terrifying the divine martial sword stone was. He had seen countless swordsmen test themselves on the divine martial sword stone, but Tian was the first swordsman to leave behind a 1,000-meter mark. Gongsun Sheng felt that this was too unbelievable. Even if he were to personally attack, he might not be able to leave a 1,000-meter-long mark on the divine martial sword stone. Nye Tian's sword intent was very strange. It was as if the powerful defense of the sword stone runes was useless in front of this sword intent. Gong Sun Sheng had never seen such a powerful sword before. It actually made him feel fearful and even threatened. If he had not experienced it himself, Gong Sun Sheng would never have believed that he would feel threatened by a high god. The others on the viewing platform, such as Xian Zongfeng and Guiwu Guangsha, were extremely shocked. They could not believe what they were seeing. At that moment, the shocked crowd came back to their senses. They all looked at Nye Tian in shock, and their lips began to tremble. Oh my God, am I seeing things? That's a sword scar that's over 1,000 meters long. 1,000 meters. It really is 1,000 meters. This is simply too terrifying. Just how powerful has Nye Tian become? This is definitely a mark that broke the record of the divine martial sword pagoda. Nye Tian is indeed the swordsman who forced the owner of the divine martial sword to lower his head. Everyone was discussing, and their eyes were trembling with excitement. They were filled with intense shock. The 1,000-meter-long sword scar was simply too terrifying. At this time, Xinyuan Yunsong's face was extremely embarrassed. He felt as if there were 10,000 maggots crawling in his throat, making him very uncomfortable. There was a stuffy fire in his heart that he couldn't swallow nor spit out. Xinyuan Yunsong, you've lost. At this moment, Nye Tian took a step forward and said provocatively, looking at Xinyuan Yunsong with a playful look in his eyes, I have lost. Xinyuan Yunsong finally opened his mouth. It was as if he had just woken up from a dream. His eyes were empty, and he had lost all his faith. He had lost completely. The difference between a 100-meter mark and a 1,000-meter mark was not something that could be ignored. Nye Tian had won this bet beautifully and indisputably. Xinyuan Yunsong had never thought that this would be the outcome of the bet. He had taken the initiative to provoke Nye Tian in order to suppress him and steal the glory from him. However, in the end, he had suffered a crushing defeat at Nye Tian's hands and paid a heavy price for it. The two had agreed that the loser would not only have to withdraw from the Evil Peak sword duel, but he would also have to promise the winner 3 things unconditionally. Take note, these were 3 unconditional promises. In other words, even if Nye Tian asked Xinyuan Yunsong to die or become his slave, he would not have the right to refuse. Nye Tian smiled faintly and said coldly, losing isn't as simple as that. You'll have to pay the price. Xinyuan Yunsong's body trembled violently, and his face turned as pale as a sheet of paper. Large beads of sweat oozed out of his forehead as he stared at Nye Tian with a terrified expression and said, Nye Tian, you knew that you could beat me. That's why you made such a bet with me, right? So what? He did have full confidence that he could defeat Xinyuan Yunsong, but he didn't expect that he would win so easily. It was a crushing victory. Nye Tian, you're so despicable. Xinyuan Yunsong's face was gloomy and his eyes were filled with anger. He wanted to eat Nye Tian alive. Am I despicable? Nye Tianling smiled and said carelessly, Xinyuan Yunsong, you proposed this bet first. You were sure that you would win. That's why you dared to bet with me. Now that you've lost, you say that I'm despicable. It seems that the swordsmen of the Xinyuan family are also sore losers. Nye Tianyu. Xinyuan Yunsong was so angry that he couldn't finish his sentence. Nye Tianyu. Indeed, the reason why he dared to challenge Nye Tian was because he was confident that he would win. However, he didn't expect that Nye Tian was much stronger than he had expected. Xinyuan Yunsong, if you want to go back on your words in front of so many swordsmen, I won't stop you. At this moment, Nye Tian smiled and glanced at everyone. At last, his eyes fell on Xinyuan Yunsong, and he said, however, in this way, the Xinyuan family will lose its prestige in the eyes of the world. Xinyuan Yunsong wasn't an idiot. How could he not understand Nye Tian's provocation? However, he couldn't say anything. After all, he was the one who agreed to the bet. If he went back on his word in front of so many swordsmen, the Xinyuan family's reputation would be completely destroyed. Chapter 1975. Countless eyes were focused on Xianyuan Yunsong, waiting for him to speak. On the spectator stand, Gongsun Shengji's expression was ugly, a bitter smile hanging on his lips. At this moment, the scene in front of him was very similar to the time when he had been forced by Nie Tian to hold the evil edge sword duel in the Azura sword field. Nie Tian was still Nie Tian, but the person he forced had changed from Gongsun Shengji to Xianyuan Yunsong. Beside Gongsun Shengji, Xianyuan Liufeng's expression was even uglier. He didn't know what to do. Xianyuan Yunsong was a genius of the new generation of the Xianyuan family, regarded as the hope of the family's rise. However, he couldn't lose the Xianyuan family's reputation. He couldn't go back on his word in front of the 9 domains swordsmen. Gongsun Shengji and the others had seen it with their own eyes. How could they give Xianyuan Lufeng a chance to go back on his word? Xianyuan Yunsong, have you thought it through? At this moment, Nie Tian's voice resounded again, reverberating in the void. It was very ear-piercing. Xianyuan Yunsong's eyes trembled slightly, and his expression also changed. Then, he hardened his heart and said seriously, "The swordsmen of the Xianyuan family mean what they say? Since I, Xianyuan Yunsong, have lost, I will accept my defeat. I will withdraw from the evil edge sword competition, and I will unconditionally promise you 3 things, Nie Tian." After saying this, Xianyuan Yunsong's expression calmed down a lot. Although he was arrogant, he still had the pride of a swordsman. He could afford to lose, and he could also afford to die. Very good. Nie Tian smiled faintly, looked at Xianyuan Yunsong with a burning gaze, and said, "Xianyuan Yunsong, you are not too stupid. You have made the right choice." Although Nie Tian had given Xianyuan Yunsong a chance to go back on his word, he didn't have any chance to do so. Gongsun Shengji and the others were watching from the side. How could he allow the Xianyuan family to go back on their word in front of the 9 domains? Nie Tian, I will withdraw from the Evil Peak sword competition. Xianyuan Yunsong calmed down and said, "Tell me, what do you want me to do?" Nie Tian's reaction was very strange. He smiled faintly and said, "Xianyuan Yunsong, continue to participate in the Evil Peak sword competition. We'll talk about other things later." Xianyuan Yunsong was stunned for a moment. After a long while, he reacted and asked, "Nie Tian, what do you mean?" "What I mean is, let you continue to participate in the Evil Edge sword competition. That's the first thing I want you to do. As for the other 2 things, I haven't thought about them yet. We'll talk about them later." Nie Tian smiled faintly as a different expression appeared in his eyes. Well, Xianyuan Yunsong opened his mouth wide, but didn't know what to say. He didn't expect that the first thing Nie Tian wanted him to do would be this. It made him feel as if he had gone from hell to heaven. Nie Tian, that's a good show of kindness and power. Gongsun Shengji, who was on the spectator stand, curled his lips slightly and exclaimed in his heart. Nie Tian's way of dealing with Xianyuan Yunsong was a typical show of kindness and power. First, he pushed the latter to the lowest point. Then he gave the latter a huge benefit so that the latter would be grateful. The Evil Peak sword competition was definitely very important to Xianyuan Yunsong. It was also his biggest goal in coming to the Divine Martial City. He was pleasantly surprised that Nie Tian gave him another chance to participate in the Evil Peak sword competition. At this moment, Xianyuan Liufeng's expression was very strange. Of course, he could tell that Nie Tian was playing the game of slap him and give him a candy. It had to be said that Nie Tian's method was very powerful. It was especially suitable for an arrogant and impulsive person like Xianyuan Yunsong. Xianyuan Lufeng could see that Nie Tian didn't seem to be hostile. Instead, he wanted to rope Xianyuan Yunsong in. Faintly, Xianyuan Lufeng felt that Xianyuan Yunsong losing to Nie Tian might not be a bad thing. Perhaps this was an opportunity for him. As for what kind of opportunity it was, Xianyuan Lufeng didn't know. Nie Tian is too terrifying. He's so young, but not only is he strong and talented, he's also very shrewd and scheming. Xianyuan Lufeng looked at Nie Tian from afar and said in his heart, "Such a person can only be befriended, not offended." Nie Tian humiliated Xianyuan Yunsong in public, which greatly suppressed the Xianyuan clan. Xianyuan Lufeng didn't want to take revenge, but to befriend Xianyuan Yinsong. It was obvious that Xianyuan Yinsong was also a scheming person. Xianyuan Yinsong, prepare for the Evil Peak sword competition. I'm looking forward to the battle with you. Nie Tian glanced at Xianyuan Yinsong, then turned around and left, leaving Xianyuan Yinsong standing there. He couldn't react for a long time. Just like that, the small disturbance calmed down. Next, the sword stone test continued. There weren't many swordsmen left. Many of them passed the test, but their performances were nothing compared to Nie Tian's. After the sword stone test ended, more than 90% of the 60 to 70,000 participants were eliminated. Only less than 5,000 made it to the next round of the Evil Peak sword competition. After a day, the sword stone test ended. Next up was the swordsman competition. The so-called swordsman competition was a battle of points between the participating swordsmen. The top 16 swordsmen would be decided. The swordsman competition would last for a few days. 5,000 participants would fight against each other. The winner wouldn't get any points, while the loser would get 1 point. If a swordsman's points reached 3 points, he would be eliminated. The swordsman competition would decide the top 16 swordsmen. They would enter the sword chief competition. 16 of the 5,000 genius swordsmen would be chosen. It was obvious how difficult it was to enter the top 16. The next day, the Evil Peak Sea was crowded. Today was the first day of the swordsman competition. Those swordsmen who didn't pass the swordstone test didn't leave. They stayed to watch the swordsman competition. The swordsman competition was different from the swordstone test. The swordsman's opponent wasn't the swordstone, but the swordsman. The battle between swordsmen was a matter of life and death. Although the swordsman competition wasn't a life and death battle, in order to advance to the top 16, all the swordsmen would give it their all. Therefore, life and death battles were common. The swordsman competition was a random duel. At this moment, many people were discussing who they didn't want to face the most. In the end, they came to the conclusion that the opponent they didn't want to face was Nie Tian. In this Evil Peak sword competition, Nie Tian was already in the limelight. In addition, during the swordstone test the day before, he had created a 1,000-meter sword scar, which showed everyone how strong he was. As a result, in the hearts of most swordsmen, Nie Tian was the most terrifying opponent. However, there are always exceptions to everything. At this moment, a skinny swordsman said with a disdainful look on his face, "That guy named Nie Tian only has the strength of a high god. I don't believe he's really that strong. The divine martial sword rock has always been strange. Perhaps his sword intent is especially suited to attacking it, which is why he can leave behind a 1,000-meter scar. The swordsman competition is different. Victory depends on true strength. I refuse to believe that I can't defeat a piece of trash who's only a higher god with my strength, as a late over god." The person's voice was very loud, so it attracted the attention of everyone. Many people looked at him like he was an idiot. Chapter 1976. Nie Tian looked at the skinny swordsman and only smiled without saying anything. To him, this was just an idiot. There was no need to bother with an idiot. You are Nie Tian. Just then, a swordsman next to Nie Tian suddenly noticed him and exclaimed in surprise. He was so excited that his teeth were chattering as if he had seen a legendary figure. Nie Tian, it's really Nie Tian. The other swordsmen reacted, and they instantly looked over with expressions of extreme astonishment, shock, and fear. Now, Nie Tian was a legendary figure in the hearts of these swordsmen. Many of them worshipped him. At this time, many people began to turn their gazes towards the lean swordsman, looking at him with a very sympathetic gaze. Everyone thought that since this guy provoked Nie Tian in public, Nie Tian would not let him go easily. He might even kill him. However, Nie Tian's reaction was very calm. He only smiled faintly and ignored everyone's stares. He turned around and was about to leave as if he did not hear anything. Seeing this, the crowd was confused and began to discuss in low voices. He left just like that. That's right. That person insulted him like that, but he actually didn't care. This is too strange. If I were Nie Tian, I would have killed this guy. Nie Tian is broad-minded and did not stoop to his level. The corner of Nye Tian's mouth twitched as he listened to the discussions of the others, but he didn't say anything. He really did not want to stoop to the skinny swordsman's level. The latter was so stupid that Nye Tian could not be bothered to teach him a lesson. Oof. However, Nye Tian had only taken 2 steps when a lean swordsman sneered and said in a loud voice, "So this is the Nye Tian that people talk about as if he's a god? I thought Nye Tian was powerful, but it turns out that he is just an idiot. This kind of person is participating in the evil edge sword competition with me. What a disgrace." When Nye Tian heard the skinny swordsman's words, his silhouette froze for a moment. However, he didn't turn his head. A moment later, a beam of sword intent shot out like a sharp blade, swift and sharp. Pooh! Before the lean swordsman could react, the corner of his mouth was cut open. Half of his face was instantly dyed red, and he couldn't even speak. Be careful what you say. If there's a next time, it won't be your mouth that gets cut, but your neck, Nye Tianling said coldly. He didn't even have the interest to turn around and look at the other party. Sob, sob, sob. The skinny swordsman was unable to speak. Even though he was an overgod, he needed some time to recover from the wound on his mouth after being injured by Nye Tian's sword intent. The surrounding people looked at the lean swordsman and laughed. The latter was really a vivid demonstration of what it meant by, "You won't die if you don't seek death." Sword Field number 1, Lulu number 3 versus number 95. At this moment, a voice rang out. The referee began to announce the 2 participants of the swordsman competition. Hearing the referee's voice, Nye Tian couldn't help but be stunned. He then looked at sword field number 1 and murmured, "I didn't expect it to be me." Nye Tian's battle card happened to be number 95. The surrounding people looked at Nye Tian, and their eyes couldn't help but twinkle. They were all very curious about the poor guy who was fighting against Nye Tian. Sob, 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 sob. Nye Tian originally wanted to enter sword field number 1, but the skinny swordsman walked over. His mouth was still bleeding, and he looked anxious. He was sobbing, but no one knew what he was saying. Nye Tian was stunned. He looked at the skinny swordsman and didn't know how to react. He said, "What? Do you want to try again?" No, no, no. The skinny swordsman was so scared that his pupils constricted. He quickly waved his hand and didn't dare to provoke Nye Tian anymore. Immediately afterwards, he took out a dual medallion and showed it to Nye Tian. Then he finally closed his mouth and said, "I admit defeat." Nye Tian looked at his battle card. It happened to be Lulu number 3. Only then did he understand that this skinny swordsman was Nye Tian's opponent. After being taught a lesson by Nye Tian, how could the skinny swordsman dare to fight against Nye Tian? He could only directly admit defeat. When the crowd saw this, they finally understood and burst into laughter. The first battle of the swordsman competition was easily won by Nye Tian. Next, Nye Tian didn't leave. Instead, he intentionally went to observe the battles in the other sword fields. In the sky above the Sea of Evil Edge, there were a total of 50 sword fields, which could accommodate 100 swordsmen at the same time. Nye Tian wanted to see if there was anyone among these swordsmen that was worthy of his attention. Because there were too many people participating in the sword test yesterday, Nye Tian couldn't observe them one by one. Moreover, many people had hidden their strength during the sword test, so they didn't want to attract too much attention. In fact, if it hadn't been for Xianyuan Yunsong, Nye Tian would also have chosen to hide his strength. After all, the more he hid his strength, the more advantage he would have in the upcoming swordsman competition. Nye Tian looked at the sword fields one by one. Most of them were overgods, so they didn't attract his attention. With his current strength, even without using the 3 great forbidden skills, he could easily fight against peak overgods. After using the 3 great forbidden skills, his peak battle prowess was comparable to a mid-stage paramount god. Therefore, overgods were no longer worthy of Nye Tian's attention. At this moment, Nye Tian's gaze was attracted by a burly swordsman. The man had a head of scarlet hair that seemed like flames, and he was about 2 meters tall. He stood there like a red-haired bull, giving off an extremely powerful aura. Nye Tian couldn't help but frown as he looked at the cultivator. He felt that this martial artist's entire body was surging with a blazing sword intent, like a rune, faintly wriggling outside his body. Nie Tian had never seen a sword intent like this before. It was like runes, constantly surging around the swordsman's body. However, this wasn't the main point. What was more important was that the scarlet-haired cultivator was actually a mid-stage paramount god, and his sword cultivation had reached the mid-stage sword martial unity realm. Nie Tian sensed the age of the swordsman's bones. He was definitely under 10,000 years old. To be able to reach such a level of strength under 10,000 years old meant that he was extremely talented. At this moment, the scarlet-haired cultivator was standing on a stone pillar in the sword field, waiting for his opponent. Soon, another swordsman appeared on another stone pillar in the sword field. It's Xing Wuji. Nie Tian couldn't help but be stunned when he saw the cultivator. This was Xing Wuji, one of the three great geniuses of the divine martial sword pagoda, along with Lin Wui and Zhuo Bufan. Xing Wuji was very strong. He had already reached the early-stage paramount god sword martial unity realm. It seemed that during this period of time, after being defeated by Zhuo Bufan and feeling bitter, his strength had greatly improved. But even so, Xing Wuji was still a far cry from the scarlet-haired cultivator. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the scarlet-haired cultivator had the strength to kill Xing Wuji in an instant. Xing Wuji was really unlucky to have to face this red-haired warrior in his first battle. "You're from the divine martial sword pagoda?" The scarlet-haired cultivator asked as soon as Xing Wuji landed. Yes. Xing Wuji felt that there was something wrong with the other's gaze, but he still nodded. Chapter 1977. After the red-haired cultivator confirmed that Xing Wuji was from the Shenwu Sword Pagoda, his face turned cold and his eyes revealed undisguised murderous intent. Nie Tian noticed this and couldn't help but wonder why the red-haired cultivator was suddenly filled with murderous intent. This was the Evil Peak sword competition, and Xing Wuji was a swordsman from the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. Logically speaking, after the red-haired cultivator found out about this, shouldn't he be more cautious? During the swordsman's competition, many swordsmen didn't want to run into someone from the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. After all, no one wanted to hurt or kill a swordsman from the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. This red-haired cultivator's reaction was the exact opposite of everyone else's. He wanted to kill Xing Wuji. It was as if he hated the Shenwu Sword Pagoda and wanted to kill everyone from the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. "Friend, I don't think I know you." Xing Wuji felt the red-haired cultivator's murderous intent. He couldn't help but be confused. "You only have one chance. Make your move." The red-haired cultivator ignored Xing Wuji and spoke in a cold voice. His eyes were filled with murderous intent. Oh no! Seeing this, Nie Tian's eyes trembled and he screamed to himself. He could feel that the red-haired cultivator's murderous intent was very strong. It wasn't a fake threat. It was real murderous intent. This meant that the red-haired cultivator was going to kill Xing Wuji. "You want to kill me?" Xing Wuji was stunned. Only now did he realize the danger. His expression changed. It's too late to realize that now. The red-haired cultivator snickered. Suddenly, a red sword intent appeared in his palm. It spun and the surrounding space became extremely hot. It felt like one was in a furnace. In the next moment, the red-haired cultivator slammed his palm. A line of fire appeared in the air and instantly turned into a sea of fire. Countless flaming swords appeared and headed towards Xing Wuji. "You want to kill me with this sword intent?" Although Xing Wuji was weaker than the red-haired cultivator, he was not afraid. He laughed coldly and stabbed his sword forward. The sword's shadow was like a flood dragon as it whizzed forward. However, right at this moment, a strange scene occurred. The fire sword in the sky suddenly released waves of cold air, which enveloped the huge sword shadow. Crack, 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 bang. Then, something even weirder happened. Xing Wuji's sword shadow was frozen in midair, and then it exploded. What happened all of a sudden made everyone take a deep breath in. They couldn't believe their eyes. That red-haired martial artist had clearly released an incomparably blazing flame sword intent, but it had suddenly erupted with a bone-chilling ice chi. This was really too strange. Xing Wuji was also shocked by what he was seeing. His eyes trembled as he sensed death approaching. He wanted to fight back, but it was too late. Bang, bang, bang. Countless fire swords fell and landed on Xing Wuji's body. Immediately, his body became riddled with holes, and he was bleeding profusely. The crowd was shocked. Who would have thought that this red-haired cultivator would be so arrogant as to really want to kill Xing Wuji? Die! Just then, the red-haired cultivator's voice was heard again. It was extremely violent and murderous. After a roar, he slammed his palm again. A 1,000-meter-long fire sword shadow appeared and attacked Xing Wuji. Boom! The fire sword shadow flew through the air, and Xing Wuji's body was completely swallowed. Not even his bones were left. In an instant, the entire Evil Edge Ocean fell into a deathly silence. Everyone's eyes were focused on the red-haired cultivator. There was shock, fear, and confusion in their eyes. This was the Evil Edge Sword Conference, not a fight to the death. Why did this red-haired cultivator want to kill Xing Wuji? With his capabilities, he could have easily defeated Xing Wuji. There was no need to kill him. Plus, Xing Wuji was from the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. Wasn't the red-haired cultivator afraid of offending the Shenwu Sword Pagoda by doing this? Right now, the red-haired cultivator didn't look afraid at all. Instead, he looked excited and happy. It was as if killing Xing Wuji made him feel extremely satisfied. After a moment of dead silence, the crowd burst into an uproar. This red-haired swordsman is too strong. He didn't even use his sword to kill Xing Wuji. Xing Wuji was one of the top 3 swordsmen of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. This red-haired young man is indeed strong, but he killed a swordsman of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda in front of so many people. This is a slap to the Shenwu Sword Pagoda's face. Isn't he afraid of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda's revenge? Yeah, he killed Xing Wuji in front of everyone. This red-haired guy is strong, crazy, and crazy. The crowd discussed loudly. They were all very excited. On the first day of the swordsman competition, there was such a terrifying swordsman who killed one of the top 3 swordsmen of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. It seemed like the following battles were going to be interesting. Xing Wuji, one of the top 3 swordsmen of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda, was killed in such a way. This was a slap to the Shenwu Sword Pagoda's face. At the same time, Gongsun Xingji and Xian Zongfeng's faces were extremely gloomy on the viewing platform. How could they not be angry that Xing Wuji was killed in such a way? But even though they were angry, they couldn't intervene. After all, the red-haired cultivator didn't break the rules of the Evil Edge sword competition. Gui Wu Guangsha, on the other hand, had a strange expression. He seemed to have sensed something, and his face turned solemn. "You bastard, you're so cruel." At that moment, a furious bellow came from the sky above the sword ground. A black-clothed referee stared coldly at the red-haired cultivator and said in a deep voice, "With your abilities, you could have easily defeated Xing Wuji. Why did you kill him?" The crowd was suddenly stunned. They looked at the judge, and their eyes could not help but burn with passion. They were obviously looking forward to a good show. "Because I like it." The red-haired cultivator raised his head and looked at the judge. He didn't show any fear. Instead, he became even more arrogant. "Bastard, you're courting death." The judge was furious. He roared and the sword aura around him rose. He was about to attack. "You want to fight me with just you?" However, the red-haired cultivator wasn't afraid at all. He sneered and said, "If you dare to attack, I can guarantee that I will kill you with my sword." The icy cold and arrogant voice, the murderous and silent gaze, all of them revealed a domineering aura that looked down upon the world. The judge felt the red-haired cultivator's aura and couldn't help but stop. There was a flash of fear in his eyes. The judge was a late-stage supreme god, but his sword principle was only in the sword oblivion realm. If they really fought, he might not be a match for the red-haired cultivator. The judge in black calmed down and didn't dare to attack, so he asked, "You bastard, why did you do this?" Chapter 1978. "I, Wind, Fire, Ice, am going to kill the people of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda." The insolent voice fell into the ears of every swordsman present. It was like a thunderclap from the 9 heavens, causing a great impact and shock. to say such words in front of all the swordsmen of the 9 realms during the Evil Peak sword competition. This red-haired martial practitioner's arrogance was enough to make one's hair stand on end. The crowd fell into silence again. The atmosphere was suffocating. This red-haired swordsman called Wind, Fire, Ice was too arrogant. He was even more arrogant than when Nie Tian had forced Gong Sunsheng at the Shura sword field. After a long while, there was finally some movement on the Evil Edge Sea. The crowd began to whisper, "Who the hell is this kid? How dare he threaten the Shenwu Sword Pagoda so blatantly? Isn't he courting death? This person must have a grudge against the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to kill the swordsman of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. Even if he has a grudge against the Shenwu Sword Pagoda, he's too arrogant to show up at the Evil Edge Sword Conference." As everyone spoke, they looked at Wind, Fire, and Ice with fear in their eyes, and their expressions became somewhat strange. Nie Tian looked at Wind, Fire, Ice with a strange expression. He had guessed the latter's identity. Wind, Fire wasn't a common surname. Coincidentally, the leader of the 1,000-Feather Tower was named Wind, Fire, Qianyu. Therefore, Nie Tian guessed that Wind, Fire, Ice was related to the leader of the 1,000-Feather Tower. Plus, Nie Tian and the others had met people from the 1,000-Feather Tower in the Divine Martial City. That meant that Wind, Fire, Ice was definitely from the 1,000-Feather Tower. Nie Tian had previously learned from Ghost Marshal Wildsand that Fenghua Qinyu firmly believed that his father, Fenghua Lianxing, was killed by the Divine Martial Sword Pagoda. Fenghua Qinyu had even established the 1,000 Tower to take revenge on the Divine Martial Sword Pagoda. When Gewu Kuangsha had met Jiao Feng, one of the 5 supremacies of the 1,000 Tower in the Divine Martial City, he had sensed that something big was about to happen. Now that Wind, Fire, Ice had appeared again, it seemed that the 1,000 Tower was indeed going to make a move against the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. The Divine Martial Sword Pagoda and the 1,000 Tower were top organizations in the 9 major realms. A life-and-death battle would definitely shake the 9 major realms. Stinking brat, you're not here to participate at all. You're clearly here to cause trouble. I'll annihilate you. At this moment, the black-clothed referee was no longer able to restrain himself. With a furious roar, his figure swooped down from the sky, and sword intent abruptly erupted from his entire body. A vast and boundless aura burst forth with a loud bang, transforming into a gigantic sword shadow that pressed down on the wind, fire, ice, and great ice. Hiss! The crowd gasped when they saw this. The people from the Shenwu Sword Pagoda couldn't help but make a move. However, he didn't know if this judge would be able to kill Wind, Fire, and Ice greatness. Courting death. Fenghua Binghong's eyes narrowed slightly, and the corners of his mouth curled up into a cold and murderous smile. A large crimson sword appeared in his hand, and without any hesitation, he directly stabbed the sword towards the sky. Boom! Where Fenghua Binghong's sword pointed, the sword intent condensed and a flaming sword shadow appeared. It was terrifying, like a giant dragon that was soaring into the sky. When Fenghua Binghong killed Xing Wuji, he didn't even use his sword. The strength that he displayed now was his true strength. Boom! Up in the sky, the 2 sword shadows collided with each other. Suddenly, the space shook, and then a shocking scene appeared. Crack, crack, crack! The flaming sword shadow released a bone-chilling cold air. It was like many giant snakes that coiled in the air, instantly freezing the other sword shadow. The crowd's eyes froze, and their faces were filled with astonishment. Fenghua Binghong had clearly released the sword intent of fire, but he was able to release extremely cold air. This was too strange. How is this possible? The black-clothed referee was also stunned when he saw this. His face turned pale, and there was unconcealable fear in his eyes. He had greatly underestimated Fenghua Binghong's strength. The latter's sword intent was much more terrifying than he had imagined. Bang! The next moment, under the gaze of countless pairs of eyes, the frozen sword shadow in the air shattered. The flaming sword shadow shot up into the sky and headed straight for the black-clothed referee. If the black-clothed referee was hit by the flaming sword shadow, he would definitely die. Stop! Just then, a loud voice was heard. Then, a wave of sword intent pierced through the air. It didn't seem to be very powerful, but it easily blocked Feng Hua Bing Hong's fatal attack. The sword intent in the air dissipated, and a figure appeared in the sky. The crowd looked over and saw that it was the divine sword master of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda, Gong Sun Sheng. At this critical moment, Gong Sun Sheng Ji personally stepped in and saved the black-clothed referee. Gong Sun Sheng Ji's appearance was unexpected. Everyone's attention was focused on him. Feng Hua Bing Hong, who are you? Why are you targeting the Shenwu Sword Pagoda? Gong Sun Sheng Ji waved his hand, signaling for the black-clothed referee to leave. He then looked at Feng Hua Bing Hong and asked coldly, "The divine sword master of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda?" Feng Hua Bing Hong stared at Gong Sun Sheng Ji. He wasn't afraid at all. Instead, he said coldly and sarcastically, "I didn't expect the Shenwu Sword Pagoda to break its own rules. I killed that swordsman, but I didn't break the rules of the Evil Edge sword competition. However, the referee attacked me just now, which was a blatant violation of the rules of the Evil Edge sword competition. The divine sword master showed up in person, which is even more despicable. Looks like the so-called Evil Edge sword competition was just a joke." His voice was calm, but it was very aggressive. Gong Sun Sheng Ji's face immediately darkened. The crowd was also stunned, and their expressions were very strange. Feng Hua Bing Hong was arrogant, but everything he said was true. The referee attacked Feng Hua Bing Hong, which was indeed the Shenwu Sword Pagoda breaking its own rules. Feng Hua Bing Hong, you could have easily won the battle. Why did you have to kill someone? Gong Sun Sheng Ji asked again. Feng Hua Bing Hong smirked. He wasn't afraid of Gong Sun Sheng Ji at all. Instead, he said with disdain, "Divine Sword Master, the swordsman competition has always been a cruel battle of life and death. Injuries and deaths are inevitable. Plus, the Evil Edge sword competition didn't say that we can't kill. You can call me cruel for killing that swordsman, but I didn't break the rules of the Evil Edge sword competition. Could it be that the referee attacked me because the other swordsmen can die, but not the people of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda?" Feng Hua Bing Hong's words made the atmosphere even more tense. Everyone looked at him with a strange expression. Gong Sun Sheng Ji's face darkened when he saw how everyone was looking at him. What Feng Hua Bing Hong said was true. He couldn't refute it. Feng Hua Bing Hong, what happened just now was indeed the Shenwu Sword Pagoda's fault. What do you want? Gong Sun Sheng Ji said after some thought. Chapter 1979. I want him dead. The words came out of Wind Fire Ice Great's mouth, but it made everyone's hearts clench and their eyes tremble. Wind Fire Ice Great's arrogance had exceeded everyone's expectations. Who would have thought that he would kill the black-garbed judge who had attacked him? This was during the Wicked Edge sword competition, the Wicked Edge Sea, the territory of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. Wind Fire Ice Great was forcing someone from the Shenwu Sword Pagoda to die. How arrogant was that? Gong Sun Sheng Ji frowned. The fat on his face couldn't stop trembling. He looked extremely embarrassed. He had already admitted that the Shenwu Sword Pagoda was in the wrong, and there was no turning back now. What? Is the Shenwu Sword Master unwilling to sacrifice the judge? Seeing that Gong Sun Sheng was hesitating, Windfire Iceberg couldn't help but sneer. His tone was deep, and his face was filled with ridicule. Gong Sun Shengji was deep in thought. He looked very embarrassed. He was the master of the divine sword, the #1 swordsman in the 9 realms. To be forced into such a situation by a junior in front of so many people was really humiliating. Gong Sun Shengji's mood was the same as it was back in the Ashura sword field. Windfire Ice Great was even more difficult to deal with in Yetian. Everyone's eyes were locked on Gong Sun Shengji, waiting for him to make a decision. Would Gong Sun Shengji sacrifice the black-garbed judge for the reputation of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda? The judge was a late-stage paramount god, so he must have a high status in the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. Master of the Divine Sword, please don't make things difficult for me. At this moment, the black-clothed referee suddenly opened his mouth and said in a loud voice, I will bear the consequences of my own mistakes. Isn't it just death? What's there to be afraid of? With that, the black-garbed judge took a step forward. His sword will surged, and he was about to self-destruct. Wait! At this moment, another voice rang out. Immediately after, a silhouette descended from the sky and blocked the black-clothed referee. Master Guiwu. Nye Tian froze when he saw the figure. It was none other than Guiwu Kwangsha. Looking at Guiwu Kwangsha's appearance, he could also see something. Nye Tian knew that Guiwu Kwangsha was the teacher of Master Thousand Plume, Wind Fire Thousand Plume. If there was a relationship between Wind Fire Ice and Wind Fire Thousand Plume, Guiwu Kwangsha would naturally be able to tell. Brother Guiwu. Gong Sun Sheng suddenly gawked, as he did not expect that Guiwu Kwangsha would appear here, causing a strange look to appear in his eyes. Guiwu Kwangsha nodded towards Gong Sun Sheng. Then, he looked at the wind flame Qianyu and said indifferently, "Young man, let people off when possible. Since Lord Divine Sword Master has already admitted his mistake, why do you have to force him?" Lord Guiwu. Seeing that it was Guiwu Kwangsha who had stepped forward, Windfire Iceberg's gaze slightly changed, revealing a sliver of respect. After that, he slightly bowed and said, "Since Lord Guiwu has stepped forward, this junior will give you face. I won't kill that person." When the crowd heard Windfire and Ice Great's words, they couldn't help but be taken aback. Their expressions became very strange. Guiwu Kwangsha had appeared, and with a single sentence, he had actually made Wind, Fire, and Ice retreat. This was truly somewhat strange. Guiwu Kwangsha's status in the sword world was very high, but no matter how high it was, it could not be compared to Gong Sun Shengji. Wind, Fire, and Ice didn't even put Gong Sun Sheng in their eyes, but were instead extremely respectful towards Guiwu Kwangsha. This was very strange. Could it be that Wind, Fire, Ice had some sort of relationship with the Guiwu Kwangsha? When Gong Sun Sheng saw that Wind, Fire, Ice Great had suddenly backed down, he gawked for a moment. Soon after, he looked at Guiwu Kwangsha, feeling extremely puzzled in his heart. "Many thanks." Guiwu Kwangsha nodded his head with a smile, though his expression was one of extreme worry. The reason why he showed up was because he already knew who Wind, Fire, and Ice Hong were. If he didn't guess wrongly, Wind, Fire, Ice Great's true identity was the son of Thousand Feather Pavilion's Tower Master, Wind, Fire, Thousand Feather. Wind, Fire, Thousand Feathers was already an extremely rare Sword Dao monster, but Wind, Fire, Ice Great Sword Dao talent seemed to be even stronger than Wind, Fire, Thousand Feathers. "Lord Guiwu, my father asked this junior to send his regards." At this moment, Wind, Fire, Ice Great suddenly transmitted his voice to Guiwu Kwangsha and said respectfully. Guiwu Kwangsha gawked for a moment before nodding his head. In this way, Wind, Fire, Ice Great had acknowledged his identity, that he was Wind, Fire, Thousand Feathers' son. According to seniority, Wind, Fire, Ice Great should be Guiwu Kwangsha's grand disciple, which was also the reason why he was willing to give face to Guiwu Kwangsha. Although Guiwu Kwangsha and Wind, Fire, Thousand Feathers were no longer in contact, their master-disciple relationship still existed. Lord Divine Sword Master, this matter ends here. However, I do not wish for something like this to happen again. If you do not wish for the people of the Divine Martial Sword Pagoda to die, then tell them to admit defeat when they meet me, Wind, Fire, Ice Great said in a cold tone, before his figure moved and he immediately left. Gong Sun Sheng's expression was gloomy, and he was extremely embarrassed, but he couldn't do anything to Wind, Fire, Ice Great. With his status, he couldn't possibly attack a junior in front of so many people. Moreover, Wind, Fire, Ice Great didn't do anything wrong, but he was too arrogant. Guiwu Kwangsha looked at Wind, Fire, Ice Great's back with a very worried expression on his face. Thousand Feathers Tower wasn't the only thing he was worried about, but also Nye Tian. Wind, Fire, Ice Great was too terrifying. Based on the strength he had displayed so far, he was definitely above Nye Tian. Just now, Wind, Fire, Ice Great had released enough power to kill a late-stage paramount god, which was something Nye Tian couldn't do. Furthermore, Guiwu Kwangsha knew that the Windfire clan possessed an extremely terrifying bloodline power. Windfire Bing Hong seemed to be suppressing the bloodline power within his body. Therefore, his true battle prowess was much stronger than what he had displayed. Guiwu Kwangsha even felt that if Windfire Ice Great fought with all his strength, he could even fight against a slightly weaker peak paramount god. Without a doubt, Windfire Ice Great was definitely a very powerful opponent, and he would be a strong competitor for Nie Tian on his path to becoming the Sword Chief. At this moment, Nie Tian's expression was also very unsightly. He also felt threatened by Windfire Ice Great. Moreover, this was only the first day of the Swordsman tournament, and there were already terrifying opponents like Windfire Ice Great. Who knew how strong his opponents would be in the following battles? Since the Evil Edge Sword duel had shaken the 9 realms, Nie Tian believed that the Holy Parliament, the Reverse Scale, and even the Heaven and Earth Net would likely send out powerful swordsmen. From the look of it, the opponent he would have to face was much more powerful than he had imagined. The Evil Edge Sword discourse was much more difficult than Nie Tian had expected. Nie Tian, it seems that if you want to become the Sword Chief, you have to improve your strength. At this time, Fat Cat's voice sounded, and it sounded a bit worried. Yes. Nie Tian nodded, then sighed and said, I am now a peak paramount god, which is already a bottleneck. It's easier said than done to improve my strength. Indeed, it won't be easy. Little Fat Cat sighed, then said, but it's not that there's no way, but you'll have to bear some risks. Furthermore, I can't be sure how it'll affect you if you use that method to increase your strength. Chapter 1980. Nie Tian could sense danger from Windfire and Ice, so he could not help but worry. If Nie Tian could not break through to Overgod before the competition for the Sword Leader began, it would be impossible for him to become the Sword Leader. However, he was currently at a bottleneck. It was very difficult for him to break through to Overgod. Many cultivators would need hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of years to go from peak High God to early Overgod. Nie Tian wanted to break through to Overgod in just a few days. That was easier said than done. However, Nie Tian remembered that Fat Cat had once said that she had a trump card for him. He had no idea what it was. Now that Fat Cat had said that there was a way for Nie Tian to become an Overgod, the latter was obviously overjoyed. As long as he became an Overgod, Nie Tian's battle prowess would increase qualitatively. At that time, he would be extremely confident about competing for the Sword Leader position. However, looking at Fat Cat's reaction, it seemed like the method of breaking through to Overgod was rather strange, and it came with great risks. Fat Cat fell silent for a while before saying, Nie Tian, it's actually very simple for you to become an Overgod. It's just that it's very dangerous. I'm not sure how it'll affect your future path of cultivation. Fat, just tell me what the method is. The more Fat Cat said, the more doubtful Nie Tian became. He could not help but urge it. You still have another origin energy. As long as you fuse with it, you'll be able to break through to Overgod, Fat Cat said sternly as she became stern. Nie Tian was stunned at first, but he immediately returned to his senses. His eyes could not help but tremble. He said, You mean the Heart of Darkness? Nie Tian possessed 2 origin energies. One was the Earth String Source, which he had already fused with his demonic energy, which was why his recovery rate was so monstrous. In addition to the Earth Origin Energy and the Earth Vein Source, he also had another origin energy, the Darkness Origin Energy. The Darkness Abyssal Plane of the Darkness Origin Power was composed of 3 parts: Heart of Darkness, Hand of Darkness, and Soul of Darkness. The Darkness Origin Source in Nie Tian's hand was the Heart of Darkness. He had obtained it when he entered the forbidden ground of Jiuying. He also knew that the Soul of Darkness was with the Holy Mother of Jiuying. Although Nie Tian possessed the Heart of Darkness, he had never fused with it. The fact that the Fat Cat wanted him to fuse with the Heart of Darkness was beyond his expectations. Yes, the Fat Cat nodded, but her face was filled with undisguised worry. Nie Tian, there's already a type of origin energy in your body. If you fuse with the Heart of Darkness again, it might reject the Earth Vein Source. If the repulsive force of the two origin energies is too great, your devil essence will not be able to withstand it. With that, Fat Cat's expression became a little strange. She continued, but once you can successfully fuse with the heart of darkness, your strength will have a qualitative increase. The repulsive force of the two origin energies. I'm afraid I can't withstand it with my current strength, can I? Tian was also a little worried. The 9 elements had always been mutually reinforcing and restraining. The repulsive nature of the origin energies was undoubtedly even more obvious. He was worried that he might not be able to withstand it. After all, Tian only had the strength of a peak high god. That's what I'm worried about as well. The Fat Cat nodded solemnly. Of the 9 elements of heaven and earth, the most mysterious are light and darkness. The repulsive force of the light element is the strongest, and it repels all other elemental energies. The fusion ability of the dark element is the strongest. Under normal circumstances, it can be fused with the other 8 elemental energies. The light element is pure, and it doesn't allow other energies to interfere. On the other hand, the dark element is chaotic, and it contains all sorts of energies. But even so, the repulsive force of the heart of darkness and the earth vein source is still very strong. Whether you can successfully fuse with the heart of darkness depends on whether your devil essence is strong enough. Tian's eyes could not help but flicker when he heard the Fat Cat's words. This was the first time he had heard of these things, and he found them extremely novel. Tian basically knew nothing about origin energy, so he obviously did not understand the relationship between the various types of origin energy. It had to be said that the Fat Cat had taught him many things. Tian, you need to make a decision carefully whether you want to fuse with the heart of darkness or not. The Fat Cat nodded. She was extremely stern. The fusing with the heart of darkness this time was even more terrifying than when Tian fused the 3 great forbidden techniques. So he had to be careful. Do I have a choice? Tian smiled bitterly as a strange light flickered through his eyes. Tian was determined to become the sword chief of the Evil Edge competition, but it seemed like it would be extremely difficult for him to become the sword chief right now. Not to mention anything else, the current Tian wasn't a match for a single Windfire Ice Grandmaster. If he could not become an overgod, Tian had no hope of becoming the sword chief at all. As a result, he had no other choice right now. He had to fuse with the heart of darkness. More importantly, fusing with the heart of darkness was a huge fortuitous encounter for Tian. He did not want to remain stuck at overgod forever. He did not have much time in the first place. Under normal circumstances, it was extremely likely that he would need several years to become an overgod. This was a very short amount of time, but he could not afford to wait because he still had many people he needed to save. Tian, I want to remind you that I have millions of years of memories, but no one has ever been able to fuse 2 types of origin energy at the same time. You need to be mentally prepared for the risks involved in fusing with the heart of darkness. The Fat Cat knew that she could no longer dissuade Tian, but she still said that. The Fat Cat understood Tian's personality well from the time she spent with him. He was steady but not crazy. Tian was determined and steady. But if he came across a fortuitous encounter, he would never give up even if it was extremely dangerous. I've thought it through. Tian sucked in a deep breath and smiled faintly. His eyes surged with unshakable confidence. All right, if that's the case, I'll begin preparing. I'll help you fuse with the heart of darkness in 3 days. The Fat Cat smiled faintly when she sensed Tian's confidence. What she admired about Tian the most was his great confidence. Tian had been through countless life or death situations, but no matter who he faced, he could always display great confidence. Tian's confidence could even be blind at times, but it was exactly this blind confidence that allowed him to never give up. He faced death time and time again, turning the situation around. Confidence brought hope, and hope was the greatest bargaining chip a person could use to overcome adversity. If a person lost hope, even the best environment would be a life or death situation for them. If a person had hope, even if they were in great difficulties, there would still be light at the end of the tunnel. The fat cat knew the risks of fusing with the heart of darkness the best. The reason why he let Nyetian do this was because he believed in Nyetian, in the God-fiend Origin Embryo, in the 9th level Chaos Beast, and in the Origin Starstone. Chapter 1981. With a movement, Nyetian directly stepped onto a stone pillar in the second training ground and waited for his opponent to appear. Very soon, his opponent landed. It was a swordsman in azure robes. He was not very powerful, only a peak over god who had reached a state of selflessness. An opponent like that just happened to be what Nyetian needed. He did not need to use his 3 forbidden techniques to deal with him easily. I am Yu Chong of the Wind Mountain Sword Sect. Please enlighten me, Sir Nyetian. Yu Chong clasped his hands. He seemed extremely courteous. Nyetian smiled faintly. He cut right to the chase and said, "Go ahead." "Pardon me." With these words, Yu Chong leaped high into the air, a long sword appearing in his hand. As he thrust it forward, a stream of sword intent whizzed out. In the next moment, 8 sword projections appeared in the air and slammed down towards Nyetian from 8 different directions. Nyetian raised an eyebrow and stabbed out as well. 8 blurs appeared in the air as well. Boom! In the next moment, the 16 blurs collided, and a great rumble rang out in the air. Sword intent surged out like waves, wreaking havoc in the surroundings. Yu Chong staggered backwards from the waves of sword intent, but Nyetian was the complete opposite. He directly charged over while enduring the waves of sword intent. Wherever his sword passed by, the sword intent would be sharp and murderous. "You've lost." Nyetian swept out with his sword, and a blur whistled past Yu Chong's head. If it had descended another half a meter, Yu Chong would definitely have died on the spot. Yu Chong stabilized himself. His forehead was covered in sweat, and he was still shaken. He clasped his hands in a hurry and said, "Thank you for showing mercy, Sir Nyetian. There are no grievances between us. I have no reason to kill you." Nyetian smiled faintly. Afterwards, he directly left with a flash. Yu Chong wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead. He was shocked. He had no idea how he had lost. Nyetian's strength was clearly a realm lower than his, but his martial body was far stronger than his. His sword Dao cultivation was the same as his, but his sword intent was far stronger than his. This was too strange. Nyetian easily won the second round, and then began to observe the battles between the other swordsmen. Right now, there were 2 swordsmen worthy of his attention. One was Xianyuan Yinsong, and the other was Wind, Fire, and Ice. Although Xianyuan Yinsong had suffered a crushing defeat to Nyetian during the Swordstone test, his strength could not be underestimated. He was indeed a formidable opponent. As for Wind, Fire, and Ice, there was no need to mention them. They were currently the strongest, and even Nyetian couldn't deny this. Nyetian could only hope that he wouldn't run into the Wind, Fire, Ice, Great, 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 Ice, Great Heart. Nyetian vaguely felt that there would be more experts in the upcoming Evil Edge sword duel. Nyetian, take a good look at the person wearing the ghost mask. At this moment, Fat Cat's voice suddenly rang out, reminding Nyetian. Nyetian's gaze froze slightly, and then he looked at the 4th sword field. He saw a swordsman wearing a ghost mask standing on a stone pillar. The swordsman wore a green ghost mask, and his aura was concealed. His eyes were extremely cold, and no emotions could be seen at all. Killer. Nyetian only needed to look at the ghost-faced swordsman's eyes to immediately confirm that this person was definitely a killer, and a top-notch one at that. The cold and emotionless eyes seemed to despise life. Only a killer could have such eyes. Moreover, the ghost-faced swordsman controlled his murderous intent perfectly, and his murderous aura was not exposed. Only a top-notch killer could do this. But other than that, Nyetian couldn't sense anything unusual about the ghost-faced swordsman, and he didn't understand what Fat Cat wanted him to see. "Don't panic," Fat Cat said, her eyes shining brightly. She looked at the ghost-faced swordsman, and her voice was a little nervous. Seeing Fat Cat's reaction, Nyetian couldn't help but be more cautious. He secretly activated his holographic divine patterns and sent them over the sword field. Since Fat Cat took this ghost-faced swordsman so seriously, there had to be something special about him. At this time, the ghost-faced swordsman's opponent appeared. He was an early-stage paramount god, and had reached the realm of sword oblivion. Wearing a mask? What are you trying to do? The swordsman didn't seem to care about the ghost-faced swordsman at all. He spoke in a cold voice, and his sword aura surged, and his murderous intent enveloped the ghost-faced swordsman. Seeing this scene, Nyetion's eyes slightly trembled, but the ghost-faced swordsman stood there like a block of wood, not moving at all. What's he doing? Nyetion thought, frowning. Even he wouldn't dare to be careless when facing an early-stage paramount god. And yet, this ghost-faced swordsman seemed to be completely ignoring him. "Watch out," Fat Cat said. "Your sword will is stirring." Right at this moment, little Fat Cat suddenly let out a strange cry. Its voice was a little sharp, obviously shocked to the core. Nyetion was taken aback for a moment. He activated his holographic divine patterns and discovered that the ghost-faced swordsman was exuding a very strange sword intent. The aura of this sword intent was very strange. It seemed to have no killing power, but it made people feel a sense of pressure that made them shudder. "What's that guy doing? Don't you want to live anymore?" At this time, many people's attention was attracted by this battle, and they all cried out, "I'm going to kill you, you stinking brat." In the next moment, the swordsman who attacked roared furiously, and the sword intent on his body suddenly converged as he raised the sword in his hand up high. However, in that very moment, the strangest thing happened. The swordsman froze for a moment, then his sword will suddenly went berserk. Then, he retracted his sword will and pushed it toward himself. Boom! A muffled boom rang out, followed by a flash of blood-colored light. The swordsman had been crushed by his own sword will and self-detonated. The gory scene caused everyone to gasp in shock, unable to believe what they were seeing. Losing control of one's sword intent and self-detonating was indeed possible, but it would only happen to low-level swordsmen or swordsmen who had gone berserk. This swordsman was an early-stage paramount god who had reached the level of selflessness. Therefore, there was no way he would lose control of his sword will. And yet, in front of so many people, he had been crushed by his own sword will and self-detonated. It was a very bizarre scene. The scene fell into a deathly silence. Everyone stared at the ghost-faced swordsman as if they were looking at a terrifying monster. Even the stupidest person could tell that the ghost-faced swordsman had done something to cause his opponent to self-detonate. However, no one could say for sure what the ghost-faced swordsman had done. Nyetion stared blankly for a few seconds before the dull look in his eyes faded away. He was still shocked. "Nyetion, did you see clearly how this guy killed them?" At this time, little Fat Cat's voice rang out. It was also surprised. Chapter 1982. Illusion. Nyetion recalled what had just happened. He was very sure that the ghostly swordsman had killed his opponent with illusion. The ghostly swordsman's sword intent contained extremely strong psychic power. It was the psychic deterrence in the sword intent that made his opponent hallucinate and self-destruct. Nyetion had to admit that the ghostly swordsman's sword intent was too strange. It was the first time in his life that Nyetion had seen something like this. Among swordsmen, it was extremely rare to find someone who could integrate psychic power into the sword intent. And it was even rarer to find someone who could use the sword intent to create illusions. This ghostly swordsman could perfectly integrate illusion into the sword intent. It was really terrifying. Moreover, from the beginning to the end, the ghostly swordsman didn't even move. He only released some sword intent to kill his opponent. This kind of killing technique was really frightening. No wonder Fat Cat had asked Nyetion to pay attention to this person. It turned out that this guy was a swordsman who could use illusion. In fact, Nyetion's sword intent also contained a kind of psychic power attribute sword intent, the soul devouring sword intent, which could attack the opponent's mind invisibly. However, the ghostly swordsman in front of him had a much better control of psychic power and sword intent. It seems that this guy will also be a strong opponent for me. Nyetion became cold and couldn't help but say in his heart, "Yes." Fat Cat nodded and said, "This ghostly swordsman hasn't revealed his real strength yet. If you encounter him, you must be very careful. Even if you have the holographic divine glyph, you may not be able to escape his illusion." Nietian let out a deep breath and nodded slightly. Illusory magic was a very unreasonable method of attack. Even a peak paramount god would be played like a fiddle in the palm of the caster's hand. Just like the swordsman who had just died, he didn't even know how he died. Nietian looked at the ghostly swordsman and said in his heart, "Which force are you from?" He had already confirmed that the ghost-faced swordsman was an assassin, so his first guess was that this person was from Enilin. If the ghost-faced swordsman was a member of Enilin, then it was highly likely that he had come for Nietian. After all, Nietian had killed the 13 thorns of Enilin. Enilin would certainly not let him off. First, it was Xianyuan Yinsong, then it was wind, fire, ice, and now there was a ghost-faced swordsman who could use sword intent to create illusions. This evil-edged sword duel was getting more and more interesting. Nietian did not have much fear in his heart at this moment. Instead, he was a little excited. He was looking forward to seeing what kind of powerful beings would appear next. Then, Nietian had his third match. His opponent wasn't strong, so he easily won. After 3 matches, Nietian's battle for the day was over. Next, he could focus on observing the battles of the other swordsmen. Nietian. At this moment, Gue Wuchan had also ended his battle and came to Nietian's side. He was a little worried and said, "There are so many powerful beings in this evil-edged sword duel. I guess it will be difficult for me to enter the top 16. Gue Wuchan had won all 3 of his battles today. However, the opponents he had encountered were weaker. Therefore, it was hard to say if he would be able to continue on. I also did not expect that the evil-edged sword duel would attract so many powerful beings." Nietian smiled bitterly, but the determination in his eyes did not change. Jian Jingyun finished his battle and came to Nietian and Gue Wuchan's side. He frowned but did not say anything. He had always been steady, but at this moment, he could not help but become worried. "Jian Jingyun, what are you thinking about?" Nietian looked at Jian Jingyun and asked with a faint smile. "Nietian, there are so many powerful beings in this evil-edged sword duel. Do you still have the confidence to obtain the position of Sword Chief?" Jian Jingyun nodded and voiced out his worries. He already knew that Nietian wanted to use the evil-edged sword duel to save Jian Qingqi. However, the prerequisite for saving Jian Qingqi was that Nietian had to obtain the position of Sword Chief. Previously, Jian Jingyun was very confident in Nietian, but now he began to worry. Wind, fire, ice, and the rest were too powerful. Their strength was almost on par with the legendary swordsmen of the older generation. Would Nietian be his match? Don't worry, I must obtain the position of Sword Chief. Nietian knew what Jian Jingyun was worried about. He smiled faintly and exuded a strong confidence. Jian Jingyun nodded, but his expression was still ugly. He hated himself for being too weak and unable to carry the burden of saving Jian Qingqi with Nietian. "Look, Lian Wui is going up." At this moment, Gue Wuchan suddenly shouted in joy and pointed to a sword field. Nietian looked up and saw Lian Wui's figure appear on a stone pillar in the sword field. Lian Wui's blood-weeping sword infant had been extracted from her body, but her battle prowess was still not to be underestimated. She had the strength of a peak overgod, and her sword Dao had reached the realm of intermediate sword martial unity. She was strong enough to fight an early or even mid-paramount god. Nietian estimated that even Jian Jingyun and Gue Wuchan might not be Lian Wui's match. Therefore, as long as the opponent wasn't too strong, Lian Wui would definitely win. Many of the people present knew Lian Wui, so her battle naturally attracted many people. A moment later, a figure landed on the stone pillar in front of Lian Wui. Who's that?" As this figure descended, the crowd frowned. Their gazes were filled with doubt, and their faces were filled with confusion. The figure was very strange. Her entire body was hidden in a loose black robe, and the place where the face should have been was a pitch black hole. It was very strange. Judging from the figure, It should be a woman. When Ye Tian saw the figure in the black robe, his eyes couldn't help but tremble, and his face was full of surprise. The figure in the black robe gave him a very familiar feeling, but its aura was very strange, which made Ye Tian feel very strange. Ye Tian immediately activated the holographic divine glyph, wanting to sense the aura of the figure in the black robe more clearly. But strangely, his holographic divine glyph didn't even get close to the figure before it bounced back. Ye Tian was stunned, and the doubt in his heart grew stronger. This is... At this moment, Fat Cat's voice suddenly sounded. She was very surprised, and after a few seconds, she said 4 words, "The Netherworld Emperor's holy robe." Hearing these 4 words, Ye Tian couldn't help but tremble, and the shock in his heart showed on his face. The Netherworld Emperor's holy robe? Hearing this name, Ye Tian couldn't help but tremble, and the shock in his heart showed on his face. The Netherworld Emperor. Although he did not know what the Emperor of the Underworld Saint Garment was, the fact that the black-robed figure could wear the Emperor of the Underworld Saint Garment clearly showed that this person was closely related to the Emperor of the Underworld. Although he didn't know what the Netherworld Emperor's holy robe was, the fact that the figure in the black robe could wear the holy robe clearly meant that this person had a close relationship with the Netherworld Emperor. At this moment, the figure in the black robe suddenly moved, and a crimson long sword appeared in her hand, releasing an extremely terrifying aura of sword will. This is... When Ye Tian saw the crimson long sword, his eyes suddenly trembled, and his face instantly stiffened. Chapter 1983. God-slaying sword. When Ye Tian saw the long red sword in the black-robed figure's hand, his pupils shrank and his expression became sluggish. He was all too familiar with this long red sword. It was Cher's sword of primordial soul, God-slaying sword. Ye Tian was stunned for a moment. Then he frowned and exclaimed in his heart, "Why is Cher's sword of primordial soul in this person's hand? And this person also has the meridians of 3 lives and is wearing the Underworld Emperor's sacred robe. Who is she? Could she be Shui?" Ye Tian was taken aback. His mouth was wide open, but he couldn't utter a single word. He couldn't believe that the black-robed swordsman in front of him was Cher. If this person was really Cher, why did her aura change completely? What was going on? The more Ye Tian thought about it, the more confused he became. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. The scene in front of him really confused him. "Make your move." At this moment, the black-robed swordsman suddenly spoke. His voice was extremely cold and even had a strong murderous intent. This voice... Ye Tian was stunned, and his body trembled. He exclaimed in his heart, "She's Shui." Ye Tian heard the voice of the black-robed swordsman very clearly. It was definitely Cher's voice. But that tone was completely different from the Cher that Ye Tian knew. Cher's voice could be very cold sometimes, but it was definitely not this kind of coldness with murderous intent. The murderous intent that the black-robed swordsman revealed was very strong. It was an extremely cold emotion, as if he was an assassin who was indifferent to everything. "Fat, what is going on? Is she Shui?" Ye Tian's mind was in a whirl as he almost roared. "Ye Tian, calm down first." Fat Cat's eyes flashed strangely, signaling Ye Tian to become cold. However, Ye Tian was extremely agitated. Under such circumstances, how could he remain calm? If that black-robed swordsman was Cher, then why did she become like this? If the black-robed swordsman was not Cher, then who was she? How could he possess the fallen god sword? Why does it sound the same as Cher's? Everything was too strange, and Ye Tian was unable to calm down. What an arrogant man! Right at this moment, Lien Wui felt as if she had been provoked. With a roar, she leaped into the air and stabbed her sword down. Suddenly, boundless sword intent whistled out and turned into a sword shadow that pressed down on the black-robed swordsman. "You're too weak." The black-robed swordsman's reaction to Lien Wui's attack was very calm and even disdainful. He sneered and directly stabbed out with his sword. A crimson sword intent appeared and turned into a huge red beam in the sky. It was like a setting sun, and it dyed the sky red. when Lien Wui's sword shadow came into contact with the huge red burial. It was unable to withstand the terrifying power contained within the red burial and directly crumbled. Ah! In the next second, a sharp scream was heard. Lien Wui's figure was blown away, but she was not injured at all. After retreating for a few thousand meters, she stabilized herself in the air. Lien Wui was frozen on the spot and couldn't react for a long time. What was going on? The crowd was stunned as well. They watched with a strange look in their eyes. Lien Wui was known as the #1 genius in the Shenwu Sword Pagoda, but she had been defeated by a single attack. This result was too unexpected. What was even stranger was that the attacker was also a female swordsman, and her strength was far above Lien Wui's. Everyone could tell that the black-robed swordsman had not used her full strength. If she wanted to, Lien Wui would be a corpse by now. It seemed like the black-robed swordsman didn't want to kill Lien Wui. She didn't even injure the latter. She is at the peak of the unity of sword and martial arts. At this moment, someone realized what was going on and exclaimed in horror. The black-robed swordsman's strength was not high, but her sword principle had reached the peak of the unity of sword and martial arts. The peak of the unity of sword and martial arts was the peak of the godly state sword principle. In the entire 9 realms, there were less than 10 swordsmen who had reached the peak of the unity of sword and martial arts. How old was this black-robed swordsman? How could she have reached the peak of the unity of sword and martial arts? One had to know that even a legendary swordsman like Guiwu Guangsha had only reached the advanced level of the unity of sword and martial arts. Is she really Cher? Nie Tian's eyes trembled. He couldn't sense the black-robed swordsman's true aura, but the latter's sword principle and sword world were too terrifying. Apart from Cher, Nie Tian couldn't think of anyone else with such terrifying talent. Why didn't you kill me? At this moment, Lien Wui came back to her senses and asked the black-robed swordsman with a frightened expression. Because you're too weak. You're not qualified to die under my sword, the black-robed swordsman said coldly. Her entire person was like an iceberg, standing there. Lien Wui was so angry that her face turned red, but she couldn't say a word. Compared to the black-robed swordsman, she was indeed too weak. The black-robed swordsman didn't waste any more words. She turned around and wanted to leave, but she had only taken a few steps when a figure blocked her way. Get out of the way. The black-robed swordsman looked at the silver-haired figure in front of him and said coldly. His attitude was Nie Tian. The person who blocked the black-robed swordsman was none other than Nie Tian. Who are you? Nie Tian asked in a deep voice. The holographic divine glyphs revolved crazily, but he couldn't break through the black-robed swordsman's spiritual defense. He couldn't feel the latter's aura clearly. I'll say it again, get out of the way. The black-robed swordsman's voice became even colder, and his entire body surged with undisguised killing intent. This was a kind of aura that could kill gods and Buddhas in their way. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed, and his expression changed. He had been with Cher for a long time, and he knew the latter very well. She would never show such an aura. Cher could be very domineering when she was angry, but it was a kind of domineering aura, not a strong killing intent. I'll also ask again, who are you? Nie Tian didn't give in and said coldly. Stubborn, you're courting death. The black-robed swordsman suddenly turned cold, and suddenly, a sword intent surged out of his body. It wasn't huge, but it was extremely fast. It condensed into a sharp blade and attacked Nie Tian. Nie Tian's reaction was extremely fast. He moved to the side and barely avoided the sharp blade, but a glaring wound was left on his neck. The black-robed swordsman's sword intent was cold and murderous. If Nie Tian was an ordinary high-god martial artist, he would definitely die. Fortunately, his reaction was fast enough, and his martial body was strong enough, so he could avoid the killing intent. The black-robed swordsman couldn't help but be puzzled after failing to kill Nie Tian, and said, Your strength is beyond my expectations. It seems that I have underestimated you. Nie Tian frowned, and the wound on his neck healed instantly. He looked at the black-robed swordsman and asked again, Who are you? Why do you have the fallen god sword? My name is Ling. The black-robed swordsman seemed to hesitate for a moment, and finally said a name before turning to leave. Ling? Hearing this name, Tian was stunned, and his eyes couldn't stop trembling. Chapter 1984. Tian frowned as he watched Snow Spirit leave. There was only one question lingering in his mind. Are Snow Spirit and Cher the same person? Tian, are you all right? At this moment, Jian Jingyun and Gue Wushan walked over and looked at Tian in confusion. Neither of them expected that Tian would suddenly stop Snow Spirit. I'm fine. Tian gradually calmed down and shook his head. He was not in the mood to continue watching the upcoming battle. He immediately left and returned to the governor's mansion. In the small courtyard, Tian was restless and paced back and forth. Snow Spirit's situation was too strange, and he could not calm down. Tian, now is the crucial moment of the evil-edge sword duel. You must calm down and not be impatient. Fat Cat's figure appeared and laid on Tian's shoulder. Fat, you must have noticed something. Tell me. Tian calmed down and looked at Fat Cat with a burning gaze. Fat Cat remained silent. It was obvious that he had noticed something, but did not say it. Merging with the heart of darkness requires a calm mind. Tian's current state is obviously not good enough. Do I really have to tell him the truth? Fat Cat's blue eyes flickered as he thought to himself. He had indeed noticed something from Snow Spirit. However, he did not say it, because he was afraid that Tian would be even more annoyed if he knew the truth. Fat, tell me. Tian saw Fat Cat's reaction and was even more certain that the latter had noticed something. Sigh. Fat Cat looked at the impatient Tian and shook his head with a sigh. Snow Spirit is Cher. Ling was Shue. Boom. Hearing this answer, Tian felt his head sink as if someone had hit him with a stick. His body trembled, and he took a few steps back, almost losing his balance. Although he already had a guess in his heart, he was still astonished and shocked when it was actually confirmed. The news that Snow Spirit was Shue was like a bolt from the blue to Tian. He was completely dumbfounded. Fat Cat knew that Tian would have such a reaction. He sighed again and shook his head. He did not say anything and waited for Tian to become cold. After a while, Tian finally calmed down, but his eyes were still trembling as he asked, Little Fatty, are you sure Ling is Shue? I'm sure. Fat Cat nodded and said, Cher is wearing the Emperor of the Underworld's saint garment, so her aura is concealed. But it can't fool me. She is definitely Cher. This. Tian sucked in a breath of cold air as his face stiffened. Then he asked, If Snow Spirit is Shue, why doesn't she recognize me? Why would she want to kill me? Just now, when Tian and Snow Spirit were talking face to face, Snow Spirit was cold as ice. She even attacked Tian and tried to kill him. If Tian wasn't strong enough, he would have already been killed by the Snow Spirit. It was impossible for Cher to attack Tian, let alone kill Tian. Shue's memories have been sealed. A strange light flashed in Fat Cat's eyes. The Snow Spirit you saw doesn't recognize you at all. You are a stranger to her. This is impossible. Tian's eyes suddenly widened. He roared angrily, and the blood in his body was surging crazily. Fat Cat looked at Tian, shook his head, and said, Tian, no matter whether you accept it or not, this is the truth. Cher's memory has indeed been sealed. She sees you as a stranger. Tian's eyes were bloodshot. Like a mad beast, he roared angrily. Who did it? Who did it? Fat Cat didn't stop Tian. He had to give him time to accept it. Cher's memory was sealed, and she could no longer recognize Tian. This was a huge blow to the latter. After a long time, Tian finally calmed down a little, but his eyes were still bloodshot. He stared at Fat Cat and asked, Is there any way to restore Cher's memory? Fat Cat was stunned for a moment. He immediately said, People with a meridian of 3 lives have very unstable memories. You should remember that Cher lost her memory for a short while after she awakened her Wan Jian bloodline. Yes. Tian nodded heavily. It turned out that Fat Cat even knew about this matter. It might have been from Tian. Cher did lose her memory for a short time, but she recovered very quickly. Fat, since Cher could recover her memory last time, she should be able to do it this time too, right? Tian suddenly thought of this and said happily. Fat Cat's expression was not good at this time. He shook his head and said, last time, Cher lost her memory because her mind was attacked by the Wan Jian bloodline. When the Wan Jian bloodline completely fuses with her body, the lost memory will naturally come back. However, it's different this time. Snow's memories have been sealed away by a powerful seal. I can feel that this seal is very powerful, and the longer it exists, the smaller the chance of Cher's memory recovering again. Even if this seal is unlocked now, Cher's memory may not be restored. At the end, Fat Cat's expression was very ugly. He didn't dare to look at Tian's reaction. He didn't want to deceive Tian, so he told the latter the truth. Tian was stunned for a while and couldn't react for a long time. After more than 10 seconds, Tian's tense expression finally turned a little better. A glimmer of light suddenly flashed in his eyes as he said, Cher's memory was sealed. It must be the doing of the nets and nets. They must know how to restore her memory, right? Maybe they know, but will they tell you? Fat Cat shook his head helplessly and said, the nets and nets must have a purpose for sealing Cher's memory. How can they restore Cher's memory? No matter what price I have to pay, I must find a way to restore Cher's memory. Tian's eyes were focused. There was no doubt in his eyes, but it was replaced by determination. Tian, you must not be impulsive now. Cher's memory is sealed, but she's not in any danger. You're too weak now, and you're far from being able to fight against the nets and nets. Fat Cat was worried that Tian would do something stupid under impulse, so he hurriedly warned Tian. I know. Tian solemnly nodded and said, I won't act rashly before the nets and nets people appear. I'm afraid that the nets and nets goal of making Cher participate in the evil peak sword meet is not simple. It's highly likely that they're targeting me. Tian knew that he had something on him that was very important to the heavenly dragnet, and that was the princess tear that Schwer had left on him. Perhaps the nets and nets made Cher participate in the evil peak sword meet because of the princess tear. Cher had lost her memory and was completely under the control of the nets and nets. But fortunately, her life wasn't in danger, and the nets and nets couldn't harm Cher. After all, the latter was someone they respected as the princess. Tian believed that it wouldn't take long before the nets and nets people would come knocking on his door. Chapter 1985. The swordsman tournament continued on the second day. After the first day of battles, about 1,000 of the 5,000 swordsmen had been eliminated, leaving only 4,000 contestants. The following battles would become more and more intense, and more people would be eliminated. In Tian's first battle, his opponent was not strong, and he won easily. Next, he began to pay attention to the battles of others. Of course, the person he paid the most attention to was still Cher, or more appropriately, Snow Spirit. At this moment, Snow Spirit was fighting with a green-clothed swordsman on the 17th sword field. Although Tian knew that his perception could not break through the Emperor of the Underworld Saint Garment, he still gave it a try, and as expected, he failed. The Emperor of the Underworld Saint Garment looked very ordinary on Snow Spirit, and it was no different from an ordinary black robe. However, when Tian looked at the Emperor of the Underworld Saint Garment, he could feel a very strange aura flowing on it. It was extremely mysterious, and it made him feel a special threat. Tian guessed that the Emperor of the Underworld Saint Garment must have other functions other than shielding the perception from the outside world. At this moment, Snow Spirit ended the battle with a sword. Her figure came down from the stone pillar of the sword field, and she came to Tian's side. Her face was hidden under the black robe, and she seemed to be staring at Tian. She asked doubtfully, "Why do you want to know who I am? Do we know each other?" "We knew each other in the past, but not now. However, we will get to know each other in the future." Tian nodded slightly and smiled. Snow Spirit did not speak, but her figure clearly stiffened for a moment before she turned around and left. "Cher, I will definitely help you recover your memory." Tian looked at Snow Spirit's figure and said to himself, Although Snow Spirit's memory was sealed, her life was not in danger, so Tian could still maintain his calm. To recover Cher's memory, he had to find the person behind the inescapable net. Tian could only wait patiently. He believed that it was impossible for Snow Spirit to appear in the evil edge sword duel alone. There must be other experts behind her. Tian. At this moment, Gue Wukon's voice was suddenly heard. It was filled with anxiety. "What's wrong?" asked Tian as he turned around to look at Gue Wutsan. The latter's forehead was covered in cold sweat, appearing to be extremely nervous. "Look at the fifth sword arena." Gue Wukon pointed at the fifth sword arena with a taut face. Tian looked towards the fifth sword arena and immediately saw a familiar figure. It was Jian Jingyun. However, in the next instant, his gaze was attracted by a figure opposite Jian Jingyun. On the two stone pillars of the fifth sword field stood two silhouettes. One was Jian Jingyun, and the other was a handsome man in gray. A terrifying sword aura surged around the man. His entire being was cold and murderous, giving off a strong sense of oppression. Tian stared blankly for a moment, then immediately used his divine sense to investigate, and his face suddenly changed. Shockingly, the gray-robed man was a late paramount god, with the power of the sword and martial arts as one. "This person is so strong," Tian exclaimed at his heart. He didn't expect that person's strength to be so formidable. A late paramount god, with the power of the sword and martial arts as one. Even Gue Wukon and Quang Sha weren't too far off. Earlier, Tian had thought that Wind Fire Eye Sword and Ghostface Swordsman were terrifying enough. Who would have thought that someone even stronger would show up? Holy shit, who is this guy? How can he be so strong? Gue Wukon couldn't help but let out a strange cry, clearly shaken by the man's terrifying strength. Tian furrowed his brows as he pondered which force these people belonged to. They were simply too powerful. Tian now knew that if he didn't reach the overgod level, he definitely wouldn't be able to take the position of Sword Chief. More and more powerful opponents were appearing, and Tian had a bad feeling about this. Most of the onlookers were looking at the fifth sword arena because the gray-robed man was just too strong. "You're from the Jin clan?" asked the gray-robed man. His voice was cold and filled with undisguised disdain. Jian Jingyun. Jian Jingyun nodded slightly, neither servile nor overbearing. He knew that his opponent was much stronger than him, but he wasn't afraid at all. Fighting someone stronger than him was a good opportunity for him to gain experience. "Jian Jingyun, you should be glad that you're from the Jian clan. That's what gives you the right to live." The gray-robed man said coldly. His sword intent surged like a beast, ready to pounce on Jian Jingyun. "You're very strong, sir, but you're looking down on me too much." Jian Jingyun understood the meaning behind the gray-robed man's words and said in a deep voice. After that, the sword intent in his body started to surge crazily. A sword aura that soared to the sky appeared and blossomed in midair. "Is that all you've got?" The gray-robed man couldn't help but sneer when he sensed Jian Jingyun's sword intent. "Damn it," Jian Jingyun roared. Even though he had calmed down, he couldn't stand the gray-robed man's mockery. The long sword in his hand stabbed out, aiming for the gray-robed man's head. An endless amount of sword intent converged in the air, transforming into a terrifying sword shadow. A violent sword cry resounded in the air as it rushed towards the gray-robed man. "You dare to attack me with this level of strength? What a joke!" The gray-robed man's arrogant voice resounded. The sword intent in his body surged, transforming into a boundless chi wave that spread in all directions. Jian Jingyun's sword shadow was extremely powerful, capable of destroying a mountain in the blink of an eye. However, in front of the gray-robed man's sword intent, it was extremely weak. It couldn't even withstand a single blow and was crushed into pieces by the surging chi wave. Rumble. Following that, the terrifying chi wave roared in the air and spread towards Jian Jingyun. Jian Jingyun frowned, and a look of terror appeared on his face as he was pushed back by the chi wave. Bang, bang, bang. The boundless chi wave was like a boulder that smashed into Jian Jingyun's body. Countless gaping wounds appeared on his body, and he was instantly covered in blood. Jian Jingyun, Goe Wushan couldn't help but cry out in alarm. The gray-robed man was too strong, and Jian Jingyun couldn't even fight back in the slightest. The eyes of the crowd trembled. The gray-robed man was displaying overwhelming battle prowess. Jian Jingyun was an early-stage paramount god, and yet he couldn't even stand up to the gray-robed man's sword intent. One could only imagine how terrifying the gray-robed man's battle prowess was. You're just an ant and a member of the Jian clan at that. There's no point in killing you. I'll spare your dog life. At that moment, the gray-robed man laughed coldly. He waved his hand, and the chi wave dissipated. Chapter 1986. Jian Jingyun. Nie Tian moved and came to Jian Jingyun's side. A powerful force gushed out from his palm and entered Jian Jingyun's body. I'm fine now. Jian Jingyun's pale face recovered a little, and he spoke with difficulty. Although the man in gray did not kill him, he had injured him badly. It would be difficult for him to recover without half a month's rest. He would probably not be able to participate in the evil edge sword competition. It's good that you're fine. Nie Tian comforted Jian Jingyun and turned to look at the man in gray. Coincidentally, the man in black also looked at him, and their eyes met. After a few seconds, Nie Tian sensed something strange in the man's eyes and asked, "Who are you?" "I am Tsang Lan, a member of the Holy Parliament. I came to the evil edge sword competition for you," Tsang Lan said in a deep voice. He did not hide anything, and his eyes were filled with murderous intent. Nie Tian's eyes narrowed. He did not expect Tsang Lan to be from the Holy Parliament. Moreover, the latter's honesty was out of his expectation. "Are you here to kill me?" Since Tsang Lan was so honest, Nie Tian did not need to hide and ask directly. "Yes." Tsang Lan's eyes flashed with murderous intent. He then sneered and said, "To be honest, your strength is far beyond my expectation. I'm curious if a weak person like you can take one attack from me." Tsang Lan did not hide anything. He was from the Holy Parliament. His purpose for participating in the evil edge sword competition was clear. It was to kill Nie Tian. Previously, the Holy Parliament and the Wind and Cloud Alliance had reached a compromise and maintained peace. The Holy Parliament could not kill Nie Tian openly, but they could let Nie Tian die in the evil edge sword competition. The evil edge sword competition was a platform for all forces to compete and was relatively fair. If Nie Tian was killed in the evil edge sword competition, he could only blame himself for being weak. The Wind and Cloud Alliance could not say anything. Because of this, the Holy Parliament sent Tsang Lan to kill Nie Tian openly. Tsang Lan was indeed a terrifying opponent. He had the right to look down on Nie Tian. At least for now, Nie Tian did not have the strength to fight him. "There have been many people who have threatened me like you, but unfortunately, all of them ended up very badly. And you, Tsang Lan, will not be an exception." Nie Tian looked at Tsang Lan and said calmly. He wasn't Tsang Lan's match now, but that didn't mean he wouldn't be in the future. Nie Tian had faced opponents far more terrifying than Tsang Lan. Even the previous leader of Sacred Union, Bu Wu Qinxiu, had died at his hands. Even then, he had never felt fear, so how could he fear Tsang Lan now? Very good. Interesting. Nie Tian, I'm looking forward to the battle with you more and more. I hope you won't disappoint me. Tsang Lan laughed arrogantly. Let's wait and see. Nie Tian smiled indifferently. He ignored Tsang Lan and left with Jian Jingyun. At this time, the surrounding crowd was in an uproar. Many people's eyes were fixed on Tsang Lan, and their eyes were trembling. Tsang Lan, he is Tsang Lan, the guy known as Sacred Sword Tsang Lan. No wonder this guy's strength is so terrifying. He is the legendary Sword Saint who can use the Sacred Sword. Sword Saint is known as the most terrifying swordsman in the Holy Parliament. I didn't expect that even he would appear. This evil edge sword duel will be very exciting. Nie Tian frowned when he heard the crowd's discussion. He asked in confusion, "Sacred Sword Tsang Lan, what does that mean?" "I'm not too sure either. I only heard that the Holy Parliament has a sacred sword called the Sacred Sword. Those who can use the sacred sword are crowned with the title of Sacred Sword. Maybe this guy called Songlan is the one who can use the sacred sword. Jin Jingyun endured the pain. When he spoke, his eyes were fixed on Songlan. You're right. At this time, a voice sounded behind Nietian and the others. Guiwu Kuang-sha came to their side and said in a deep voice, "The Holy Parliament does have a sacred sword called the Sacred Sword. But for hundreds of thousands of years, no one has the ability to use the sacred sword. In the history of the Holy Parliament, only one swordsman used the sacred sword for a short period of time. But later, he couldn't bear the power of the sacred sword and was devoured by it. This guy called Songlan is the second person to use the sacred sword. Although this person is young, he has a high reputation in the sword world. He has the title of Sacred Sword. Since he can control the sacred sword, it means that his sword intent must be very terrifying. Rumor has it that only a swordsman with a strong sword intent can obtain the recognition of the sacred sword and control it." Guiwu Kuang-sha said. He couldn't help but look at Nietian with a worried expression. "Nietian, if the name Sacred Sword Songlan is true, then he will be your strongest opponent in the evil-edged sword duel. So that's how it is." Nietian nodded solemnly. It seemed that the appearance of Songlan represented the Holy Parliament's determination to kill him. Sacred Sword Songlan. Just by hearing this name, one could feel a very strong aura. Nietian's eyes flashed. At this moment, he wasn't feeling fear but excitement. He wanted to see for himself how terrifying the legendary sacred sword was. "Nietian, you can't force things. If the evil-edged sword duel can't save Jian Qingqi, we can think of another way." Guiwu Kuang-sha looked at Nietian and transmitted his voice. He knew that Nietian was very strong, but Songlan was definitely not someone to be trifled with. Even if Nietian had a supreme monstrous talent, it was impossible for him to beat Songlan's opponent. Indeed, talent could make up for some of the difference in strength. But at this moment, the difference in strength between Nietian and Songlan was too big. This was something that no talent could make up for. If Nietian insisted on fighting, it was very likely that he would die in Songlan's hands. "Lord Guiwu, don't worry. I know what I'm doing." Nietian knew what Guiwu Kuang-sha was worried about. He smiled faintly and appeared calm. Songlan was very terrifying, but Nietian was not someone to be trifled with. When he fused with the Heart of Darkness and broke through to the Overgod realm, he was confident that he could fight Songlan. At the same time, on the viewing platform high above, Gong Sun Sheng, Xian Zongfen, and the others were very surprised. In this evil-edged sword duel, there were many people that they did not expect to appear. Why are there so many people with strange strength in this evil-edged sword duel? Even the Holy Parliament has sent Sacred Sword Songlan. This is very abnormal. Gong Sun Sheng was very puzzled. In the past evil-edged sword duel, the Holy Parliament had never participated. But now, they suddenly sent Sacred Sword Songlan. This was too abnormal. Other than Sacred Sword Songlan, there were a few other swordsmen with strange strength. One was Wind Fire, Ice, one was Ghostface Swordsman, and the last one was Snow Spirit. Gong Sunsheng really could not understand where these strange and terrifying swordsmen had come from. Vaguely, he had a strange feeling that something big would happen in this evil-edged sword duel. Chapter 1987. Next, the swordsman tournament continued. Nietian's luck wasn't bad. He didn't encounter any strong opponents in several battles. The few swordsmen that he fought with weren't a threat to him. After Nietian ended his battle, he secretly paid attention to the battles of the other swordsmen. The day's battles ended quickly. Other than a few people from before, Nietian didn't find anyone else worthy of his attention. The experts that appeared on the stage were already a great threat to Nietian. He didn't want any more experts to appear. Nietian returned to the courtyard of the city lord residence and pondered about the evil-edged sword duel. Now that the swordsman tournament had been going on for 2 days, Nietian had basically paid attention to all the experts that were worth paying attention to. So far, there weren't many people who posed a threat to him, but there were also quite a few. There were a total of 5 people: Xinyuan Yunsong, Wind Fire, Bing Hong, the ghost-faced warrior, Snow Spirit, and Songlan. Among the five, Xinyuan Yinsong and Snow Spirit were relatively less of a threat to Nietian. Windfire, Bing Hong, and the ghost-faced warrior posed the greatest threat, and Songlan was undoubtedly the greatest threat. The swordsman tournament had been going on for 2 days, and yet Tian still hadn't encountered an opponent that was worthy of him using the 3 forbidden techniques. However, the following battles would definitely be more intense, and he might have to use the 3 forbidden techniques to continue advancing. Nie Tian didn't want to use the 3 forbidden techniques too frequently. He was already too reliant on them, and it wasn't a good thing for him to improve his strength. Although the 3 forbidden techniques didn't have any side effects on him now, who knew if they would become a burden to his martial body after a long time? Nie Tian, do you want to integrate the Heart of Darkness now? Fat Cat suddenly appeared and asked Nie Tian. Yes. Nie Tian nodded and said, the sooner I integrate the Heart of Darkness, the better. I need to improve my strength as soon as possible. The Heart of Darkness is the essence of darkness. If we want to fuse with it, it will be very risky. We must first find a secluded place where we won't be disturbed, said the Fat Cat with a nod. Nie Tian thought for a moment, looked around, and murmured, if that's the case, I'll go find the godly sword master and borrow a secluded place from him. Fusing with the Heart of Darkness was not an ordinary cultivation. During this process, one could not be disturbed at all and needed absolute peace. To be safe, Nie Tian wanted to ask Gong Sun Sheng for help. Nie Tian could have asked Third Lady Gong Sun for such a small favor. The reason why he asked Gong Sun Shengji was that he wanted to ease their relationship. He still didn't know that Gong Sun Sheng's attitude towards him had completely changed. Just when Nie Tian was about to go look for Gong Sun Shengji, he saw 2 figures appear outside the small courtyard. He raised his head to take a look and couldn't help but be stunned for a moment, because the people who had come were actually Gong Sun Shengji and Guiwu Kwangsha. The appearance of Guiwu Kwangsha didn't surprise Nie Tian, but Gong Sun Sheng's sudden arrival made Nie Tian a little surprised. Nie Tian. Gong Sun Sheng walked over quickly. When he saw Nie Tian, he seemed very amiable, like a kind elder. Lord Godly Swordmaster. Nie Tian slightly bowed. The other party was so enthusiastic, so he naturally couldn't be cold. As he spoke, Nie Tian looked at Guiwu Kwangsha, hoping that the latter would give him some hints. Why did Gong Sun Sheng suddenly appear? Ever since Nie Tian embarrassed Gong Sun Sheng in the Azure Sword field, he hadn't formally met the latter. Now that the latter suddenly appeared, there must be something. Guiwu Kwangsha bitterly smiled. He was only accompanying Gong Sun Sheng, so he didn't know the latter's purpose in looking for Nie Tian. Little friend Nie Tian, there was a small misunderstanding between the 2 of us before. You won't bear a grudge against I, right? Gong Sun Sheng took a step forward, sat on the stone table in the small courtyard, and said with a clear smile. Nie Tian was stunned for a moment. How could he not hear that Gong Sun Sheng clearly wanted to reconcile with him? Junior wouldn't dare. Nie Tian reacted and immediately said with a smile, in the past, Junior has also gone overboard and made things difficult for Lord Godly Swordmaster. I hope Senior can be magnanimous enough to forgive me. Gong Sun Sheng laughed and gestured for Nie Tian to sit down. He said, little friend Nie Tian, what are you saying? You and I don't get to know each other without a fight. Yes, we don't get to know each other without a fight. Guiwu Kwangsha laughed and quickly said to smooth things over. Nie Tian faintly smiled. It seemed that Gong Sun Sheng really wanted to reconcile with him, so he no longer acted polite and directly said, Lord Godly Swordmaster came at the right time. Junior just wanted to pay a visit to Lord. Oh, Gong Sun Sheng was smart and immediately understood that there was a hidden meaning in Nie Tian's words. He said, what's the matter? There's a small matter that I want to ask Lord Godly Swordmaster for help. Nie Tian faintly smiled and said, Junior wants to find a secluded place that absolutely cannot be disturbed by anyone. I wonder if there's such a place in the City Lord's mansion? Of course there is. Gong Sun Sheng laughed heartily. Immediately, a strange expression flashed in his eyes. His complexion also changed. He said, Nie Tian, actually, I came to find you because there's something I want to tell you. Just as I thought. Nie Tian smiled inwardly. Gong Sun Sheng really did want to talk to him about something, but he hid his expression well. He smiled and said, "Lord Godly Sword Master, please speak." Gong Sun Sheng nodded and took a deep breath. His expression became more serious as he said, "Nie Tian, I came to find you this time as the Godly Sword Master of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. I would like to invite you to join the Shenwu Sword Pagoda." As his indifferent voice rang out, both Nie Tian and Ghost Marshal Quang Sha gawked at the same time. Their expressions instantly changed as they looked at Gong Sun Shengji in astonishment. They didn't expect that Gong Sun Sheng came to find Nie Tian for this matter. As the godly sword master of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda, Gong Sun Sheng was the supreme existence in the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. He personally invited Nie Tian to join the Shenwu Sword Pagoda, which showed his sincerity and how much he valued Nie Tian. Nie Tian was stunned for a moment. Gong Sun Sheng's sudden invitation was out of his expectation. "Nie Tian, as long as you join the Shenwu Sword Pagoda, you can directly become the Sky Sword Soul of the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. You can use any cultivation resources in the Shenwu Sword Pagoda at will." Gong Sun Sheng saw Nie Tian's reaction and suddenly said, "If you are willing, I can teach you personally. Plus, we are friends, not master and disciple. What do you think?" Nie Tian's eyes flickered as he went blank again. Gong Sun Sheng's change of attitude was so fast that Nie Tian couldn't accept it. Not long ago, Gong Sun Sheng wanted to kill Nie Tian with his own hands. Now that he was inviting Nie Tian like this, Nie Tian couldn't help but feel nervous. "Nie Tian, are you still hesitating after I made such an offer?" Seeing that Nie Tian didn't respond, Gong Sun Sheng couldn't help but say, "If you doubt I's sincerity, you can name your own conditions. As long as I can do it, I will agree." Nie Tian frowned and couldn't help but smile. Gong Sun Sheng wasn't only sincere, but he was also persistent, which made him even more confused. Nie Tian couldn't understand why Gong Sun Sheng wanted him to join the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. Chapter 1988. Gong Sun Sheng's insistence on inviting him at all costs made Nie Tian cautious. Gong Sun Sheng was able to become the sword master and suppress someone like Xian Zongfeng. This was enough to show that he was not someone to be trifled with. Nie Tian didn't believe that Gong Sun Sheng was willing to pay such a high price to invite him only because of his talent. Nie Tian had shown his amazing talent a long time ago. It was a bit late for Gong Sun Sheng to invite him now. Vaguely, Nie Tian had a guess. Maybe Gong Sun Sheng had something to ask of him. "Sword Master, I shouldn't refuse you since you think so highly of me. However, I am not used to being restricted by others. So, let's talk about joining the Shenwu Sword Pagoda later." Nie Tian thought for a moment and said, "I won't restrict you." Gong Sun Sheng was a bit anxious. He quickly waved his hand and said, "My friend Nie Tian, if you join the Shenwu Sword Pagoda, no one will restrict you. You can come and go as you please. Even I will not force you to do anything." Nie Tian frowned. The doubt in his eyes grew heavier. The more Gong Sun Sheng was like this, the more alert he was. There was no free lunch in this world. Nie Tian knew this better than anyone else. Guiwu Quang Sha's expression slowly changed. He originally thought that Gong Sun Sheng was only interested in Nie Tian's talent and wanted to invite Nie Tian to join the Shenwu Sword Pagoda. However, seeing Gong Sun Sheng's anxious look, it was not that simple. Guiwu Quang Sha and Gong Sun Sheng had known each other for many years. Gong Sun Sheng was not an evil person, but he was definitely not a good person either. He must have something to ask of Nie Tian if he gave such a good offer. However, Guiwu Quang Sha did not understand. With Gong Sun Sheng's identity, how could he ask Nie Tian for help? "Sir Divine Sword Master, you and I are both smart people. Some things are better left out in the open." Nie Tian's lips curled into a slight smile. He decided not to hide anything and spoke directly. Gong Sun Sheng was taken aback at first. He clearly didn't expect Nie Tian to be so direct. Then, he revealed an awkward expression and forced a smile. He coughed twice and said, "Nie Tian, my young friend, I do have a small matter that I need your help with." Nie Tian laughed. He had guessed correctly. Gong Sun Shengji the old fox, had something to ask of him. Gongsun Xingji was an old monster who had lived for hundreds of thousands of years. Nye Tian was very curious about what it was that made him beg in such a humble manner. Lord Divine Sword Master, since it's just a small matter, there's no need to be so polite. Just say it. As long as this junior can help, I will definitely not refuse. Nye Tian smiled and said in a playful tone. He wasn't a fool. How could he not see that what Gongsun Xingji wanted his help with was absolutely not a small matter? However, Nye Tian didn't refuse. Speaking of which, he and Third Lady Gongsun had some friendship. For the sake of Third Lady Gongsun, he couldn't directly refuse Gongsun Xingji. Gongsun Xingji's expression changed again and again. In the end, it became very complicated. There was fear, embarrassment, and some hesitation. Lord Divine Sword Master, say something. Seeing that Gongsun Xingji didn't speak for a long time, Guowu Kuangsha couldn't help but become anxious and couldn't help but urge. Gongsun Xingji's gaze swept over Nye Tian and Guowu Kuangsha. Finally, he sighed and said, "A few months ago, I broke through to the legendary realm of sword and martial arts as one. You all know about this, right?" "Yes." Nye Tian nodded and looked at Gongsun Xingji, waiting for the latter to continue. When Gongsun Xingji came out of seclusion, Nye Tian was present. How could he not know about this matter? If it weren't for the monster Sakura, Gongsun Xingji would most likely be the only legendary swordsman in the 9 realms. Breaking through to the legendary realm was a great thing, but Gongsun Xingji's expression was very awkward. This was very strange. Alas, Gongsun Xingji sighed again and said, "Actually, with my talent, it's impossible to break through to the legendary realm. You are all swordsmen, so you should know that the realm of Sword Dao gets more and more difficult the further you go. The pinnacle of sword and martial arts, as one, is the limit of my Sword Dao. Before the last seclusion, I also went into seclusion several times. Each time, it would be hundreds or even thousands of years, but the result of the seclusion was always a failure. The last time I went into seclusion, I knew that there was no hope of breaking through to the legendary realm. So I took the risk and chose a path of no return." A path of no return. Nye Tian and Guowu Kuangsha were stunned at the same time. They didn't quite understand what Gongsun Xingji was talking about. Alas, Gongsun Xingji sighed for the 3rd time and said, "In the sword pavilion of the divine martial sword pagoda, there's a sword technique left behind by an archaic swordsman. It records a very mysterious sword technique. But unfortunately, the sword technique is only a remnant and not complete. Therefore, this sword technique is regarded as a taboo, and no one is allowed to practice it. You practice this forbidden sword technique in order to break through to the legendary realm?" Guowu Kuangsha couldn't help but let out a strange cry, his face full of shock. Nye Tian's reaction was very calm as he looked at Gongsun Xingji with an indifferent expression. Gongsun Xingji practiced the forbidden sword technique in order to break through to the legendary realm and obtain stronger combat power. This was not strange at all. A swordsman's pursuit of the realm of Sword Dao was originally very strong. But on the path of Sword Dao, apart from the swordsman's own efforts and opportunities, the most important thing was the talent of Sword Dao. Guowu Kuangsha's talent in Sword Dao was already considered top-notch. He was now at the advanced sword and martial arts as one. But if he wanted to reach the pinnacle of sword and martial arts as one, without any fortuitous encounters, he would need at least 100,000 years, or even longer. And if he wanted to break through the pinnacle and advance to the legendary realm, it was almost impossible. It was precisely because of this that many martial artists would often choose to take risks out of desperation in order to reach a higher realm. This was a very common thing among martial artists. Take Nye Tian, for example. He practiced 3 great forbidden techniques at the same time, and he was about to fuse with the heart of darkness. Each of these things could be considered as taking risks out of desperation. The difference was that Nye Tian would succeed every time he took risks out of desperation. Other martial artists did not have his strength and luck. Gongsun Xingji took risks out of desperation. On the surface, It seemed that he had succeeded, but looking at his current reaction, it was estimated that he had failed. Moreover, the price of his failure was very high. Otherwise, he would not have come to ask Tian for help. Yes. Gongsun Shengji nodded his head, his eyes flickering with a strange light. He said, I practiced the forbidden sword technique, condensed the forbidden sword intent, and successfully broke through to the legendary realm of sword and martial arts as one. But speaking up to this point, his expression suddenly became very ugly. He continued, I originally thought that I had succeeded, but I did not expect that the forbidden sword intent was so terrifying that my martial body could not withstand it at all. Right now, I'm constantly being tortured by the forbidden sword intent. Tian and Guiwu Guangsha were stunned at the same time, and their eyes couldn't help but tremble. Gongsun Shengji had the strength of a peak paramount god. On top of that, he had already reached the pinnacle of sword and martial arts as one. His battle prowess was definitely in the top 10 of the 9 major realms. Even with such strength, he could not withstand the forbidden sword intent. How strong was this sword intent? Chapter 1989. Tian stared blankly for a few seconds, then turned to Gongsun Shengji and asked, Is the forbidden sword intent really that powerful? Tian found it hard to believe that some kind of sword intent was so powerful that even a peak paramount god's martial body couldn't withstand it. A peak paramount god's martial body was already close to the legendary immortal body of a saint. If such a martial body couldn't withstand the sword intent, then the sword intent must be so powerful that it would make one's hair stand on end. Gongsun Shengji looked at Tian with a dazed look in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but suddenly lifted his shirt and revealed his exaggerated belly. This is... Tian looked down and saw that Gongsun Shengji's trembling belly was covered with a layer of strange blood-colored runes. It was as if there were countless blood-colored worms wriggling in his belly. It's not just here. Gongsun Shengji suddenly stretched out his arm, which was also covered with blood-colored runes. This is the forbidden sword intent? Tian and Guiwu Guangsha asked at the same time, their faces filled with shock. Gongsun Shengji nodded at first, then shook his head. This isn't the forbidden sword intent. It's the forbidden blood seal that was left on me by the forbidden sword intent. Tian became cold. He frowned and activated the holographic divine patterns to carefully sense the forbidden blood seal in Gongsun Shengji's body. His expression couldn't help but become complicated. He could sense that the forbidden blood seal contained a terrifying sword intent power, and it was very strange. It was constantly absorbing Gongsun Shengji's sword intent and blood qi. Tian had seen power that could absorb blood qi before. Rui Qinyu's devour power could absorb blood qi. However, it was rare to see a power that could devour sword intent. Especially when it happened to an expert of the sword Dao, it seemed even stranger. After a while, Gongsun Shengji calmed down and said, I originally thought that after I condensed the forbidden sword intent, I'd already fused it with my original sword intent. But now I know that the taboo sword intent is constantly devouring my sword intent. The taboo blood seal is formed from the condensation of the taboo sword intent. The forbidden blood seal is in my body. Not only is it devouring my sword intent, but it's also devouring my blood energy. In just a few short months, my body was almost completely filled with the forbidden blood seal. At every moment, my sword intent and blood energy are constantly flowing away. If this continues, I won't live for more than a few months. Upon hearing this, Tian and Guiwu Guangsha couldn't help but look at each other before simultaneously sucking in a mouthful of cold air. Gongsun Shengji was a peak paramount god, and as a result, had hundreds of thousands of years of lifespan left. Unfortunately, the forbidden blood seal's ability to absorb blood qi was too terrifying. It had compressed Gongsun Sheng's lifespan of hundreds of thousands of years to only a few months. The scariness of the forbidden blood seal also showed how powerful the forbidden sword intent was. It turned out that Gongsun Sheng had encountered such a tricky situation. No wonder he had been so friendly to Tian and offered such attractive conditions. But Nye Tian still didn't understand why Gong Sun Sheng wanted him to join the divine martial sword pagoda. Could it be that Gong Sun Sheng knew he didn't have long to live, so he wanted someone to succeed him as the divine sword master? This idea popped up in Nye Tian's mind, but he immediately rejected it. Although he was talented in the Tao of the sword, he was too weak. There was no way he could become the divine sword master. Furthermore, Gong Sun Sheng didn't seem to have any intention of choosing the next divine sword master. That made Nye Tian even more confused. What was Gong Sun Sheng's real purpose in inviting him to join the divine martial sword pagoda? Exalted divine sword master, Nye Tian said, looking directly at Gong Sun Sheng. Just tell me what you want. Exalted divine sword master. Gong Sun Sheng was also looking at Nye Tian, but his eyes shone with the light of excitement, as if he were a dying man who had seen his last life-saving straw. Nye Tian couldn't help but be stunned. He thought to himself, "Don't tell me he thinks I can save him. Nye Tian, my young friend, please save me." Gong Sun Sheng's expression suddenly changed. He knelt down on one knee in front of Nye Tian and spoke with a trembling voice. "Exalted divine sword master, what are you doing? Get up." Nye Tian was startled and quickly helped Gong Sun Sheng up. He wasn't used to people kneeling to him, especially when it was a senior in the sword world. Although Nye Tian didn't like Gong Sun Sheng, he was third Lady Gong Sun's father. He had to at least show some respect. Nye Tian helped Gong Sun Sheng up and looked at him with confusion. "Exalted divine sword master, you're suffering from the forbidden blood seal. I really want to help you, but I'm too weak. Even you can't withstand the forbidden sword intent. So how can I save you?" Nye Tian, Gong Sun Sheng grabbed Nye Tian and suddenly said, "You have the God-Fiend origin embryo, right?" HM. When Nye Tian heard the words God-Fiend origin embryo, his eyes trembled. His expression was clearly saying, "How did you know?" Gong Sun Sheng knew what was on Nye Tian's mind and said, "I've met people from both the Nye clan and the Qi clan. You once released a sword intent that contained the aura of both the God Confinement embryo and the Extreme Devil embryo. That's why I know you're a God Devil nascent embryo." Nye Tian's expression changed slightly. Only now did he remember that he had used the God Fiend sword intent during the Sword Stone test. Gong Sun Sheng had seen through his God Fiend sword intent. Gong Sun Sheng was indeed a legendary swordsman. Nye Tian had only used the God Fiend sword intent once, but he could see through so many things. It wasn't easy. "Lord Divine Sword Master, since you already know who I am, please speak your mind." Now that Nye Tian's identity had been exposed, he no longer concealed it. "Nye Tian, don't be nervous. I mean you no harm. Whether you're willing to save me or not, I won't reveal your identity," Gong Sun Sheng said solemnly. "Exalted Divine Sword Master, how can I help you?" Nye Tian asked directly, not wanting to waste any more time. Even though Gong Sun Sheng had promised that he wouldn't reveal Nye Tian's identity, who knew what he was really thinking? "Nye Tian, release the sword intent you used during the Sword Stone test," Gong Sun Sheng said excitedly. After a moment of pondering, Nye Tian unleashed a stream of sword intent from the God Devil's sword, which surged into his palm. "Quick, use this sword intent to attack me." Gong Sun Sheng was very excited to see the God Fiend sword intent again. His eyes trembled as he shouted. Nye Tian was stunned for a moment. Then he thought of something. He raised his palm, and the God Fiend sword intent in his palm turned into a sword intent blade, whistling out. Gong Sun Sheng didn't defend himself. The sword intent blade pierced through his body.